The first wind on the ship's deck. I don't know what brought you here tonight, but I remember vividly the moment I set foot here. It was the year 1700. New York, or rather New Amsterdam at that time, was no more than a piece of land battered by relentless winds, where torn sails hung limp above the murky waters. I stood there, my hands trembling as I clutched the frayed wool of my coat, in whose pocket quietly hid a piece of dry bread and a crumpled piece of paper, on it only 3 words in French: Rue des Cendres. I don't know if that street truly exists or if it was just the final illusion of a man in exile, but I walked toward it like a sleepwalker lost in the fog of a world that had never called my name. The murmurs from the east. I still remember the cold that silently crept into my collar when I stepped onto the decaying wooden dock, where the East River flowed quietly as if waiting for something undefined. The surface of the water gleamed with silver streaks as the sun lazily woke up at the horizon, and the seagulls circled above as if they, too, were long-time residents of this new land. As I followed the soft clay path, I saw an old woman carrying water from the public well. Her headscarf was a faded color, her eyes dry and cracked as if they had weathered countless winters. She didn't ask where I came from, nor did she need to know my name. She simply looked at me for a long while, then pointed eastward, toward a few simple wooden houses stacked haphazardly together. I didn't say a word, I only nodded, thanking her with a gentle gesture, then continued my way. The morning breeze swept across the low rooftops, carrying the smell of burning wood and pig feed, the scent of a primordial New York, the kind of scent I had carried in my memory all my life. A bell rang from the small chapel at the end of the street, the solitary sound in the wilderness. I stopped, listened, as if time had slowed for a moment, as if I had just stepped into a long, unbroken dream. And it was at that moment I understood I was not just here to start over. I was here to witness the birth of a city, every stone, every story, every person, as if I had belonged here even before I was born. The room above the Black Bread Bakery. I rented a small room above the bakery of a German couple named Kremer. Every morning, the smell of toasted barley mixed with the subtle sourness of rising dough wafted through the gaps in the wooden floor, waking me up like a call to life. The room was only about 3 arm spans wide, with a small window facing west, where the sunset sometimes bathed the wooden walls in a deep reddish bronze, reminding me of the afternoons by the sea, where I had left my homeland to search for something that even now I cannot name. The bed creaked every time I turned. There was a simple table, a candle burning lower each night, and a few old books I had picked up from a Dutch book vendor by the docks. I didn't understand the language in them, but I liked the way the ink had faded to brown, and how the pages rustled when I turned them, as though they had witnessed something far more important than I. In the evening, the sound of horse-drawn carts clattered on the cobbled street below, mixed with voices of immigrants, English, Dutch, French, and strange tongues I had never heard before. New York at that time was a chaotic symphony, but full of life, a city learning to speak its first words in many languages at once. I often sat by the window for hours, just watching the shadows pass by in the glow of the oil lamps. Each shadow was an untold story, each footstep a silent melody in the night. I didn't know that here, amid the strong smell of bread and the whispers of the market street, I would begin to rewrite my life, not with a pen, but through the quiet existence in a city growing every day, like a child full of dreams and expectations. The fisherman at the end of the wharf. There is a man I often see every afternoon. He usually sits at the end of the dock, where the waters of the Hudson meet the moss-covered stone shore, holding an old, weathered fishing rod. People call him Elias, but I've never heard him introduce himself. Each time I approach, he merely nods, his eyes never leaving the water. He doesn't speak much. Sometimes I wonder if he was once a sailor, or a salt merchant from Barbados, or just a man who has forgotten the language of his own people. But on those afternoons when the wind blows hard from the sea, he begins to speak not with words but with slow gestures, with the way he ties the fishing line, removes the fish scales, and with a faraway gaze that never rests in the present moment. I remember one time when the rain suddenly poured, he told me to sit in the old wooden chair beside him. There was no shelter, but he handed me a piece of tarp, old and smelling of salted fish, and said, "Let the rain fall. A man can dry, but memories stay wet forever." From then on, I understood that Elias didn't sit there to fish. He sat there to hold on to something that time was trying to erase, memories of a son who boarded a ship and never returned, or memories of a homeland whose name had vanished from the map. And I, the newcomer, the stranger, sat beside him every afternoon, like a student of silence, of listening not with ears, but with the spaces between two sighs. In a city that's screaming to become something great, Ilya's reminded me that sometimes simply sitting still is a way of existing. At the end of Stone Street. At the end of Stone Street, where the cobblestones had worn down from the wheels of carts and the footsteps of those who earned their living, I once lived in an attic. It wasn't much, a small room with a low wooden ceiling, a window frame eaten by termites, and an old stone fireplace that always creaked on cold nights. But to me, it was the first place I was called the tenant. The landlady was a widow from Ireland named Moira, thin, austere, with a voice that always rang out like a prayer. She seldom smiled, but would always place a bowl of warm porridge by the window sill whenever I came back late, soaked from rain or lost between new alleys. I still remember the smell of that attic, the scent of firewood ash, coarse fabric, and something that always reminded me of childhood, though I couldn't quite pinpoint what. Every night I would lie down listening to the wind howling through the wooden gaps, the footsteps fading away on the street, and imagine stories without endings. That attic was where I wrote my first words in a worn leather notebook. I have arrived, and I am alive. In a city where everyone was busy finding ways to survive, my quiet existence in that small attic became the most sacred thing. It wasn't a permanent home, but it was the first place I called home in this strange land. And sometimes things that seem temporary linger in memory longer than what we call forever. The man selling books at the Thames Crossroad. There's an intersection where Thames Street meets Dock Street, where the wind from the East River blows into the thick air filled with the smell of tar, sawdust, and lime. And there once stood an old bookstall without any sign, just a hunched man sitting beneath a rotting wooden awning. I met him for the first time on a foggy morning when New York was still half asleep after the night's rain. I was searching for a map not to guide me, but to find a sense of belonging somewhere. The old man, with eyes as gray as ash and a voice as dry as an old book, didn't sell maps. He only sold memories, bound in hard covers and stacked in piles high enough to reach his shoulders. "Are you looking for directions?" he asked without looking at me. "I'm looking for a reason," I replied, not knowing why I spoke the truth. He handed me a thin book, its cover torn, with only one line left on the first page. Those who don't know where they're going sometimes find the most precious thing. I didn't pay a penny, he didn't ask for any. It wasn't a transaction, it was a moment. Later, when I passed by again, the bookstall was gone, as if it had never existed. But the book was still in my coat pocket, dry, light, and always reminding me that sometimes you have to get lost to truly find yourself. The sound of the violin from the quiet alley. New York at that time didn't have much music. The evenings were filled only with the sound of wind howling through wooden cracks, the clattering of hooves, and the slamming of doors in fear. But in a small alley behind an old warehouse near Hanover Street, I once heard a melody as fragile as mist and as sorrowful as memory. It came from a second-floor window half open, with a silver curtain fluttering like a hand waving at a stranger. I stopped in the cold wind to listen to the strings playing quietly and with a longing as nameless as the yearning it evoked. I had never seen the player. I only knew that every night I passed by I would hear that same tune. Sometimes it was a slow, mournful song, other times like a lullaby from someone long gone. On snowy nights when the streets were covered in white, I stood there almost trembling yet unwilling to leave. For that sound held me there as if it knew I was drifting, and it was the thread pulling me toward something distant, something real. They say the house is abandoned, the door is locked, no one comes or goes. Some say the music comes from a girl who died many years ago, still sitting there every night, waiting for someone who will never return. I didn't ask any more questions. I simply stood in silence, listened, and walked slowly, with a part of my soul still lingering in that melody in the quiet alley. The shoemaker on Pearl Street. Pearl Street at that time didn't seem like anything special. It was just a muddy stretch of road near the river where small boats docked and merchants silently exchanged goods. But at the corner near the broken lamp-post, there was a small, narrow, and dimly lit shoe shop, which only opened when the fog still clung to the air. The shopkeeper was an old Dutch man with a white beard and cloudy eyes, always wearing a worn leather jacket covered in shoe dust. People called him Pieter, but I never knew his true name. He didn't speak much, only bowed his head to work, each stitch steady, his hands dry and cracked like tree bark. I went there one morning in early October when my old shoes had torn apart after many days of walking on cobblestone streets. He didn't ask where I was from nor if I had money. He simply nodded, took my shoes, and gestured for me to sit and wait. The shop smelled of wood, saddle, soap, and time. On the walls hung faded sketches, seemingly of shoes from many different places, shoes from London, Amsterdam, and a place called Königsberg that I had never heard of. When the old man returned my shoes, they were almost like new. Sturdy, warm, and strangely, they fit perfectly, as if he had measured my feet in some distant dream. I bowed my head in thanks and pulled out a few coins. He pushed my hand away, quietly saying something in Dutch that I didn't understand, but his gaze seemed to say, "The road is long, go on, and remember that someone once cared for your first step." From then on, I never returned to that shoe shop. Not because I didn't want to, but because the next time I passed by, it had disappeared, as if it had never existed. Unclaimed letters. I once worked in a dark corner of an old post office near Broad Street, where unclaimed letters were gathered in a large wooden box. Every morning I would sift through them, old, faded envelopes, most of them damp or sealed in tatters. They were words that never reached the ones they were meant for. I remember once in the bitter cold of January, I opened an envelope with no clear address. It had only one line written, "To the one I love, whether that person exists or not." Inside was 3 scribbled lines of French poetry, written in ink that had smudged. "You left the door open for my imagined footsteps, but the wind answered for me." I kept that letter even though it wasn't according to procedure. Each night, when the oil lamp flickered and cast shadows, I would read it over and over, as though the invisible voice were whispering to me through time and distance. In that room full of letters, I slowly understood something that no book had ever taught me, that people live more by hope than by truth, that a letter, even if it never reaches its destination, still holds the warmth of the one who wrote it. And sometimes, the only thing we need in life is to know that someone somewhere once wrote something just to send it to us. New York in 1700 didn't have many people, but it had countless letters that were never answered. Fragments of memories that fell between the rotting drawers, where unrequited loves, late apologies, and unfinished dreams quietly lay unread. And I, in that hidden corner, became the keeper of memories for those whose faces and names were long gone. The talking walls. For a while I lived on the second floor of an old tavern near the Hudson River. They called it the second floor, but in reality, it was just an attic room with a leaky tiled roof and wooden walls soaked in the smell of tobacco, sweat, and old secrets. The tavern was called the Silent Oak, not because it was quiet, but because there used to be an old oak tree by the door, now reduced to a charred stump like coal. I remember the first night there. It rained for a long time. The sound of raindrops on the wooden roof was like someone tapping a rhythm with trembling fingers. I lay listening and began to imagine that the walls around me could talk. They told stories that no one else spoke of, fights fueled by jealousy, awkward proposals in drunken haze, and the laughter of a girl whose name no one remembered anymore. On some nights when the fire died down and the wind crept through the cracks in the door, I heard a sigh, very soft, as if it came from a restless soul, still lingering in that room due to an unfulfilled promise. I wasn't afraid. In fact, I felt close, as though someone was sharing that solitude with me. It was in that room that I began to write, not to be read, but to soothe what couldn't be spoken. I wrote for the nameless souls, for myself on sleepless nights, and for New York, a city where every wall has witnessed more than 100 books could tell. Now that room may have been torn down or renovated into a bright, modern space, but I believe that if someone stood there in the middle of the night and listened in silence, they could still hear the ancient whispers, the things that only appear when one truly listens. The clock that no longer ticked. I once met an old Scottish man who lived in a red brick house at the end of Water Street near the riverbank. His name was Angus, but the people around here called him the Keeper of Time. That nickname wasn't because he kept time for anyone, but because his house was filled with hundreds of clocks, all old and all stopped. Each clock was a memory. Some came from Europe, with cracked glass still tinged with smoke from Hamburg, or faint bloodstains on the hour hand from a store in Liverpool that had been robbed. There were clocks from Dutch trading ships, salvaged from the wrecks of rotting ships at the bottom of the harbor. All of them had stopped at a certain moment, 5:43, 11, 17, or 1:55, but to Angus they were still alive. "Time doesn't die," he said when I asked why he didn't fix them. "It just doesn't need to go anywhere anymore." He lived alone with no family, no close friends. Every morning he would polish the glass faces of each clock with a faded silk cloth, whispering something in his native tongue that I couldn't understand. Once he placed my hand on the clock above the fireplace and asked, "Do you hear it?" I listened, and I swear I heard a faint ticking, not from the clock hands, but as if it came from a human heart. Angus passed away the following winter in silence. No one knew his real age. They only knew he had grown old like the walls he lived with. When they opened the door to his house, all the clocks inside suddenly started ticking again, each one by one, ringing out before fading like a symphony of parting. I'll never forget that moment. It seemed as though he had taken the time of the whole house with him. The market in the mist. I don't remember exactly when I first passed through that market. I only know that on that morning the fog was so thick, it covered everything like a huge gray silk sheet, engulfing the dock near Pearl Street. The sound of wooden clogs, the calls of vendors, and the smell of dried onions, lard, and damp fabric, all mixed in the air. It wasn't the market of today. No signs, no fixed stalls, only makeshift wooden planks covered in burlap where people traded salt pork for apple cider, a carved piece of wood for a dull knife, or a curse for a comforting glance. I'm not joking. I once saw an old woman hand a vendor a coin in exchange for a silver bracelet, then bow her head and mumble something into the vendor's ear. The other person shuddered, then fell silent, as if a soul had just been traded away. When the fog lifted, the market vanished. Those passing by only saw the wet ground, a few footprints left behind. But if someone came at just the right time, at the right hour around dawn, when the church bells still mingled with the cold breath of morning, they could stumble into that market, just like I did. I remember a girl selling honey. Her hair was thick and black like walnut sap. She didn't speak, just handed me a small jar. "Take it," she said, "if you've ever loved someone who has died." I didn't reply. I just knew that my hand still holds that jar to this day, though it's dry, and the honey inside has long turned into golden streaks stuck to the glass, like a memory that can never be wiped clean. That market was a place where time blurred. People exchanged things they didn't understand. Sometimes I wonder, could it be that here, the city began to take root in the dreams of the living? The door that never opened. There was a door located on the side of a broken brick house on Stone Street that for 10 years I lived in New York. I never saw anyone enter, nor did I ever see it open. It wasn't large or imposing. It was simply a dark oak door, locked with rusted iron hinges with no nameplate, no doorknob. In fact, it seemed like there wasn't even a pathway leading to it. In front of it was a small patch of moss-covered ground, surrounded by a rotting wooden fence, often covered in snow or dry leaves falling from the roof above. The people around, if they even noticed it, would just shake their heads quietly and keep walking. They didn't talk about it, as if no one wanted to name the unexplainable. I once tried to approach it on an autumn evening when the mist fell like cold silk upon the street. My hand touched the door, and, for some reason, my chest tightened as if a rope was being tied from the inside. A very faint voice, whether real or rising from my heart, whispered, "Don't." I stepped back, not from fear, but from understanding. Some doors are not meant for the living. Perhaps beyond it lies the memory of another life, or a mistake locked away, guarded by the very forgetfulness of the entire neighborhood. Many years later, I lived long enough to witness that house being torn down. The construction workers, when they broke through the wall where the door once stood, found only brick. There was nothing behind it, no passageway, no room, nothing at all, as if it had never existed. But I know it was there. I still remember the cold wood under my fingertips, and the whisper in the mist. The offbeat bells. I once lived next to an old church with a gray stone roof and moss-covered walls, where the bells rang every morning and evening as a quiet reminder that time waits for no one. But what was strange was that the bells never rang the same twice. On Monday mornings, they rang like glasses clinking in a tavern. On Tuesday, the sound was deep and long, like the final whisper of someone about to depart. There were times I sat silently for hours just waiting for the bells, hoping to catch some invisible pattern. But each time they rang, it was a different voice, a different tone, a different feeling in my chest. I told this to the bellkeeper, an old man whose name no one knew, only that he lived in a small room next to the bell tower, kept a blind cat, and drank black tea with no sugar. He just looked at me and smiled, a smile tilted like the roof of the church. "The bells don't change," he said, his voice light as the wind. "It's the heart of the listener that does." That sentence silenced me. All my life, I thought the world operated outside of me, that sounds, images, people, all existed independently and unchanged. But perhaps it is what we carry in our hearts that colors everything around us. Since that day, I stopped trying to predict the bell's sound. I simply listened to it as I would listen to my own heart, letting each toll guide me back to places where I once got lost, or where I was once saved. The child under the awning. I once thought I came to New York to start over, to find a new life. But on a cold afternoon, under the rotting wooden awning at the corner of Hanover Street, I realized I was not the only one searching for a new beginning. The child was no older than 7. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, his feet bare, and he clutched a headless doll in his arms. He sat huddled, his eyes following the people passing by without ever speaking. It was as if he feared that the sound of his voice would shatter the world that remained in his heart. I had nothing in my pocket but a cold boiled potato from the morning. I gave it to the child, thinking it was all I could offer. But then the child looked up at me, and in his eyes was a silence that no one could buy, a lesson I would never forget. He didn't say thank you, he just quietly took the potato, split it in half, and handed one half back to me. We sat there under the awning, sharing the poorest meal I had ever had, but it was also the first time in months that I felt my heart warm. After that day, I never saw the child again. The doorman said that a Franciscan friar had taken him away. Perhaps that's true. Perhaps he had found a safer place. Or maybe, like many souls in this city, he was only there to teach me something, and then disappeared like morning mist at the docks. I walked past that awning many years later, seeing other children, but none had that look. No one shared what little they had, even when there was nothing left to keep. The room with the creaking door. They say New York is a land of opportunity, but to me, at that time, it was just a place with a bed that no one claimed and a roof that didn't leak too badly. I found a small room on Stone Street, more accurately, an attic above an old tavern, where every night was filled with the smell of tobacco smoke and the hoarse singing of drunken sailors. The door to my room creaked every time it opened, as if warning that this place wasn't for dreamers. The wooden floor was creaky, the ceiling slanted, and the curtain was just an old piece of burlap hanging there. But I didn't ask for anything more. After a long, foggy journey, all I needed was a place to rest my head. The landlord was Mr. Giles, an older man, though his eyes still had fire in them. They said he had once been a captain of a rum-running ship, later pretending to be a priest to escape a hanging sentence. I never asked, and he never told. Every evening he would bring me a bowl of thin porridge, and I would pay him by fixing the hinges, chopping wood, or cleaning the yard. One night the weather turned unusually cold. The wind from the Hudson River howled through the cracks in the door like the sighs of sea spirits. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Mr. Giles's footsteps packing the house, always steady, slow, never in a hurry. He never locked the door, he never had. Then one night he no longer knocked on my door. I found him sitting motionless in his chair in front of the fireplace. His hand gripped a faded piece of paper, a photograph of 3 people, him, a young woman, and a newborn child. No one knew if he had a family, no one asked. I quietly closed his door, leaving it unlocked, keeping the unspoken promise of the lonely, not to intrude, not to share. Later, every time I walked through the damp streets of New York, I still heard the creaking of the door in the wind, as if Mr. Giles was still there, guarding a world he once lived in and once left behind. The smell of ink and the dream of letters. After days of wandering, I found a job at a printing press hidden behind Trinity Church, a black brick house stained with smoke, with narrow windows and a faded wooden sign that read Caleb & Sons Printing and Woodcutting. No one in the shop was named Caleb, and there were no sons, just an old bald man with ink-stained hands named Silas. He didn't ask my name, he simply handed me a steel brush and motioned, scraped the ink, cleaned the press, and so I began. The work repeated every day like the rhythm of the church bells, from early morning until the candlelight could no longer illuminate the letters. We printed everything: complaints, announcements, cheap novels, even menus for the tavern down on Pearl Street. The paper was rough, the ink thick, and each letter was made up of tiny lead blocks assembled by hand. A small mistake meant discarding the entire print. But I loved that work. There was something sacred in arranging each letter, each punctuation mark, as if assembling the voice of a city learning to call its own name. New York was no longer New Amsterdam, but it was not yet a dream. It was still unfinished, rough, just like the pages I dried every night. Silas was quiet, but he read a lot. He kept a wooden box under the table containing illegal prints, banned books from Europe, poems of the exiled, even clandestine translations of the Bible. One night he handed me a trial print. If you want to learn from these letters, they do not lie. I learned slowly, quietly, each word, each passage, in the dim light of the candle stuck in a bottle. It was also in that printing press that I wrote my first letter home. No one replied, but that no longer mattered. I had learned how to tell my story with ink, with paper, with a voice that didn't need anyone to confirm it. And then one spring day, Silas disappeared. On the workbench, he left an unfinished page with only one line: "Freedom is the only thing worth printing," in bold. I folded that paper, tucked it into my coat pocket, and stepped out onto the street. New York was beginning a new chapter. The fishermen in the first snowfall. I will never forget my first winter in New York. The snow arrived quietly, no wind, no sign, as if the sky merely exhaled, and everything around me suddenly turned white. For the first time in my life, I saw snow cover the wooden roofs, freeze the barrels of wine that hadn't been pulled inside yet, and stiffened my hands so much that I had to dip them in an ash bucket to keep the blood from freezing. I left the print shop in December when the wages were decreasing and Silas still hadn't returned. I found a job pulling nets by the docks, a rough, cold job, but there was bread and a bowl of hot fish soup at the end of the day. That was where I met them, the nameless men with no homes, no common language. Some were from Portugal, some spoke a form of ancient Dutch that I only half understood. But on the fishing boat, the only language was weight, the weight of the ropes, the weight of the fish, the weight of the sky pressing down on our shoulders every morning. We went out to sea when the fog was as thick as milk and returned when the oil lamps began to glow on Broad Street. Some days the boat was full of fish. Other days we hauled in nothing but sea trash and seaweed, but what I remember most wasn't the smell of the fish, but the singing. An Irish fisherman had a habit of humming while casting the nets. The melody was old, slow, and as sad as the land he had left behind. I didn't understand the words, but the rhythm stayed in my mind like the heartbeat of the old street I had never known. The snow fell without stopping for a week. The small boats didn't dare to venture out. We huddled under the awning of an abandoned warehouse, drinking strong apple cider that burned our throats and telling each other endless stories. Stories about lost ships, about a fish as long as a tree trunk with blood-red eyes, about a woman who had seen the entire city submerged under snow. I listened not because I believed, but because I learned that in a city like New York, people don't live by truth, but by what others believe to be true. In one white snow night, when everything was silent, I looked up at the snow-covered rooftops and wondered, does the snow remember where it fell? I remember. Broad Street Market and the unspoken handshakes. Broad Street back then was unlike any street I had ever walked through. It wasn't bright or wide like its name suggested. It was just a strip of muddy land between two rows of wooden houses, where wastewater and muddy shoes mixed together. But it was here that New York, or rather, the people within it, lived the truest. The market was held every Monday and Friday morning. There were no proper wooden stalls, no price tags hanging above. Everything was laid out on old burlap mats in hand-woven baskets or sometimes just placed directly on the damp ground. Some people brought chickens, some brought pickled cucumbers, others laid out dirt-covered onions from Staten Island. And then there were people like me, carrying nothing but eyes that listened and hands ready to carry something for a meal. I learned how to read a person by how they bargained. The soft-spoken ones were traders, the tough ones were the ones who had been hungry for years. I learned that some transactions didn't happen with words, just a glance, a nod, or a piece of bread hurriedly stuffed into your hand. An old black woman, once a freed slave, would give me a piece of burnt corn every morning. She never asked where I was from, and I never asked how many times she had been sold. Between us there was a silent language, one that only those who had lost much could understand. One day I helped a Frenchman load a barrel of grapes onto his cart. He didn't speak English, he just waved and smiled, the rare smile I saw in that bustling market. In return, he shoved a bottle of homemade wine into my hand, wine that smelled like burnt firewood and tasted as sweet as forgiveness. Broad Street was where I understood that, in New York, no one truly sells what they have, they only give away parts of themselves. A turnip for a promise, a bunch of dried onions for a seat under the awning when it rains. I don't know when I started calling that street home. Perhaps it was when someone called me over just to ask, "Will you come back tomorrow?" As if my presence, however fleeting, was worth remembering. New York never says directly that it needs you. It just opens its heart by making you feel that if you disappear, the place will be a little colder. The attic and the sound of a city breathing. The first night I did not sleep under the sky, nor under a proper roof. I was allowed to sleep temporarily in the attic of a tailor's shop run by a widowed Dutch man. He didn't say much, only pointed up to the wooden loft and then retreated behind the hanging curtain, where the dim light of the oil lamp flickered like a memory. The small attic was just big enough for a straw mattress, a candle that had melted halfway, and a small round window overlooking Pearl Street. Outside, the silver moon mingled with the fog, lingering like an unfinished dream. That night I didn't sleep. I listened. For the first time I truly heard the city, not the clamor of the day, but the whispers of things left unsaid. The sound of a horse's chain clinking against a wooden post somewhere down the street. The sound of water dripping from a leaky roof into a rotting wooden barrel. The sound of footsteps slowly crossing the cobblestones, as if following a trail of memory. And there was another sound, soft, steady, continuous, like breathing. It was unclear where it came from, whose it was, or when it started or ended. It felt like the breath of the city, a living being fed by memories and hopes, sleeping under the fog. I suddenly thought, is New York as lonely as I am? Do those wooden walls hold more than just the wind? Do they also hold dreams that never had the chance to be spoken? I sat back against the wall, my hands wrapped around my knees, and let the sound of the city's breathing lull me. For the first time after so many days of struggle, I felt held, not by anyone, but by this place with its gentle silence, its indifferent acceptance, and its steadfast presence without explanation. I understood everyone who has lived here long enough has had a night like that. A night when the city becomes the blanket that wraps around them, not with affection, but with understanding. The quiet man at the dock. The next morning I left the attic before the sun could rise. The wooden boards beneath my feet were still cold and damp with dew, and the smell of charcoal from the kilns in the Dutch district lingered in the air like the remnants of a sleepless night. I walked down to the dock without any particular purpose, perhaps out of habit or simply to hear the wind. The wind in New York that year smelled of salt and rotting wood, as if all the ships that had sailed away left a trace of memory on the planks that sighed beneath each step. There by the largest mooring post I saw him. A Native American man, sitting cross-legged on a cloth bundle, his back straight as an old tree, his eyes half closed and his hands resting gently on his knees. He didn't look at me, but I saw him. I had never seen anyone sit like that, so peaceful that no words were needed. There was something in his silence that made me hesitant to disturb it, as if my step, even just a little heavier, would shatter a layer of memory resting peacefully. I sat not far from him, also silent, and strangely in that silence I heard more than I ever had in any sermon, more than any advice spoken aloud. The wind blew through his cloak, lifting the hand-tied fringes. A string of shell beads clinked in the breeze. I didn't know his language, but I understood that his presence was sacred. Some people exist as if they carry the past on their shoulders. Some souls don't need to speak, they just need to sit there to remind you that this place, no matter how unfamiliar, once belonged to someone. I didn't ask his name, and he didn't ask why I was there. We just shared a morning, sitting on the same dock, listening to the waves, like two people weaving the first fragile threads of a connection without any bindings. When I stood to leave, he opened his eyes and looked at me. No smile, no bow of the head, just a steady gaze as if saying that I had been remembered. And I knew I would never forget that morning. Autumn and the morning market. New York in October carries a smell unlike anywhere else, the scent of damp maple leaves, wet wood, and the sweet ferment of pickled apples mixed with strong wine. The city doesn't have the vivid autumn of a painting, but it carries a vague nostalgia in every step on the dry yellowed leaves. I remember the first time I walked into the wholesale market on Broad Street. It wasn't a place of elegance or order. It was the private world of traders who bartered laughter for bread, with their calloused hands and eyes following the clouds through the canvas roof. The calls echoed from the Dutch cheese sellers, the French selling apple cider, and the Irish with dirt-covered potatoes. Each sound had its own color, its own melody, as if the entire market was a symphony of life that had never been written into words. I remember a woman selling strawberries. Her face was sun-kissed, and her hands swiftly wrapped each ripe berry in leaves. She spoke in old French, but her eyes told a whole story of a land by the Loire River, of a young man who never returned from the war, of a son working the fields outside New Rochelle. I didn't buy anything that day, but I stood there for a long time. I listened, because I understood in a place like that, not everyone wanted to sell the things they carried. Some just needed someone to listen to the story breathing between the sighs. Autumn came quickly and left just as fast. That Broad Street market no longer exists, only memories of rough wooden stalls and the voices still echoing in me like the wind blowing between two walls of time. And I wonder, could it be that all the precious memories are wrapped in the smallest things? The old tavern and the distant melody. That evening the air was colder than usual. The mist was thick on the cobbled alleys, and the oil lamps at the street corners flickered like old souls who hadn't yet found peace. I entered a wooden tavern hidden behind Stone Street, the sign hanging askew as if it had forgotten its own name. Inside was another world. Dim light flickered from the fireplace, the scent of ash mingled with strong liquor and human sweat. The men, wearing wide-brimmed hats, sat at rough wooden tables, drinking in silence. The clink of spoons against glasses, the creaking of chairs, and a distant sound of music echoed from the darkest corner of the tavern. No one paid attention to the musician. an old man with silver hair down to his shoulders, his thin fingers gliding over the strings as though untangling his own memories. The melody had no words, just a sad, distant tune like the sea wind hitting the planks of a ship. But to me, each note seemed to seep through layers of clothing, quietly entering the deepest part of my heart. I sat there in that strange silence, and for the first time since I arrived in this land, I felt my eyes blur. Not because of any clear sorrow, but because the music had stirred up things I hadn't dared to remember. My mother's lullaby, my father's shadow silently walking the fields, the old house in Alsace, where I had left without looking back. The old man didn't speak when the music ended. He just looked at me for a long while, then nodded. That nod wasn't for me, but for us, the exiles, the souls trying to live in a place that never called itself home. When I left the tavern, the air was still cold, but the music remained inside me, like a memory that no one could take away. And from that moment on, I understood sometimes longing doesn't need to be spoken. Just a melody, a glance is enough. The first snowfall in the city standing still. The first snow fell at the beginning of December that year, when the winds from the Hudson River blew strongly through the rotting wooden houses and jagged rooftops. I woke up because of the cold, not because of the sounds of people or carts, but because of an absolute silence, a silence so thick and white, as if the whole city had been buried in time beneath an endless quilt of snow. I opened the creaky door of the room I rented by the week at the price of a meal. Outside, New York was covered in pristine snow. No footprints, no sound, only the blurry rooftops in the mist and the bare trees standing alone, as if waiting for something that would never come. I took each step down the stairs, leaving the first footprints on the empty street. Every step seemed to carve itself into my memory, not because of the cold, but because for the first time I saw the city's beauty, a quiet beauty, almost surreal. There was no smell of fish from the docks, no shouts of children playing near the old church, only the wind, the snow, and myself in that brief moment, feeling like I truly existed. An Irish child ran past me, his face flushed and curly hair covering his nose. He smiled and threw a handful of snow into the air. I didn't know his name, but his laughter melted a part of the cold inside me. For the first time in months, I also smiled, even if just a little. I turned to look behind me. The footprints I had left were already fading. The snow continued to fall, and I understood this. In this old city, everything could be erased, traces, the past, even loneliness. But from that one can also begin again, every day like a blank page covered in snow. A confession in the cold. I found shelter in an old church leaning at the edge of Broad Street. The dome had partially collapsed from a storm a few seasons ago. The wooden doors hung off their hinges, and the cross atop was nearly slipping from the gray sky. But on a cold December night, it was still the only place that could shield me from the wind and hold some warmth from the candles that had long burned out. I pushed open the door, the hinges creaking like the sigh of someone who had once prayed here long ago. Inside the nave, an elderly man was sitting with his head bowed. His thick coat was covered in snow, and his hands gripped a worn rosary, as bent as his own crooked back. I didn't speak, I simply sat on a bench a few steps away from him. The space between us seemed to be held by something sacred, not faith, but by a shared weariness that we both understood. Then he began to speak, not looking at me, not caring who I was. I abandoned my daughter that year for a deal with the shipowner. She cried, calling for me on the deck, but I turned away. I thought I was doing the right thing, giving her a chance to escape this place. But now every night I see her standing at the water's edge, that gaze, unforgiving. I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't a priest, nor was I someone who could cleanse anyone's sins. But in that moment I realized, in New York, 1700, not everyone comes to start over. Some come to run away, some come to wait for forgiveness they will never receive. The wind howled through the church, extinguishing the last candle. The man still sat with his head bowed, and I, walking out of there, carried his story like a small stone in my coat pocket, heavy, but unable to be left behind. The smell of bread on Stone Street. If anyone were to ask me what the one scent is that reminds me of mornings in New York that year, I wouldn't say the smell of the sea, nor the smell of burning wood, nor the scent of old liquor from the taverns by the docks. It is the smell of warm bread, perfectly baked, drifting out from a small kitchen at the end of Stone Street. The owner of that kitchen was Madame Claret, a French widow who lived quietly in a narrow house with no sign on the front, but you could tell just by walking past. That scent spread all the way to the end of the street, seeping through the cold brick cracks, mixing into the breath of both the poor and the rich. She came to New York from Rouen after losing her husband in an accident on the Seine River. People said she had once been a baker for a noble family, but no one knew for sure. To me, the only thing I believed was her hands, rough like the bark of winter trees, but when kneading dough, they became as gentle as touching a memory. I often came early not to buy bread but to sit by the wooden window, listening to the sound of dough being kneaded, the crackling firewood, and the stories she told in French mixed with broken English. One day a young soldier returned from the battlefield. He couldn't remember his mother's name, but he clearly remembered the smell of her brioche. Every day I make that same bread, just waiting for him to come back. I never knew if that soldier ever returned, but I knew Madame Clairette didn't just bake bread, she baked the broken memories, turning them into something pleasant, golden, enough for a stranger like me to feel remembered in a city that didn't even know what to call itself. When she passed, the kitchen fell silent, but somehow the smell of bread still occasionally returned on mornings when the wind changed direction. Perhaps the city too knew how to mourn someone like her. The birdcage vendor at the corner of Hanover Market. There is a small corner of the market at the end of Hanover Street, where the late morning light always slants through the branches of an old elm tree, casting shadows on the worn wooden tables piled with goods. But amidst the countless shouts, the clinking of wooden clogs, the arguments filled with the scent of fish sauce and loose change, there was a strange silence. That was the stall of the old man who sold bird cages. He didn't sell birds, only cages, and when someone asked, "So where are the birds?" he would often respond with another question, "Why do you think a cage needs a bird?" I met him one autumn morning when the dew had not yet lifted from my sleeves. The bird cages hung suspended on ropes, swaying gently as if they were holding invisible souls. The cages came in all shapes, small ones like pumpkins, large ones as big as flower baskets, square cages, round cages, cages with tiled roofs, cages with false doors, and one cage even had a faded piece of red cloth hanging from it, as if to memorialize something no one spoke of. "Did you ever keep birds?" he asked when he saw me looking for a long time. "Once," I replied, "it died the winter before last." He nodded, his wrinkled hand brushing over a smooth wooden cage, as if it were a cherished heirloom. "People come here thinking they're buying a cage to trap something," he said, "but sometimes they need a cage to keep what has already flown away." I didn't fully understand at that time, but I bought a cage. I hung it in the window of my room for 3 winters. No birds, nothing at all, just the cage. And every morning when the sunlight passed through the wooden slats, I would remember the man who sold cages, the man who had perhaps spent his life understanding that things unseen still need to be kept. The unclaimed letters on Broad Street. On Broad Street, next to a shabby honey candle shop, there was a small, weathered building that once housed thousands of unclaimed letters. No sign, no nameplate, just a tarnished brass bell and a window always closed tight. The locals called it by a strange name, the Funeral Home of Letters. I stepped into it one January morning when the cold wind cut like a thin blade across the street. Inside the low-ceilinged main room, towering wooden shelves were filled with faded envelopes. Some were sealed with red wax, some tied with fabric threads, and there were even letters written by children in clumsy handwriting, addressed to grandfather in New York next to the big tree. All of them lay still, no recipient, no reply. An elderly woman with smoke-gray hair was the only one tending to the place. She didn't speak much. She simply bowed her head slowly and invited me to sit on a wooden chair next to the old stove. She said, "Here each letter is a wandering soul. When the writer is gone, when the recipient has never read, I keep them like keeping whispers that were never heard." I picked up a letter written in French, the paper stained like fireplace ash. Inside was a love confession from a soldier sent to his former lover in 1689. Perhaps that girl never came to New York, perhaps the soldier died in Saint-Domingue, but the words were still here, still waiting to be heard. Before I left, she handed me a small box. Inside were unread pieces of paper and a handwritten note. "If you find anyone who needs an unsaid word, please give it to them for me." I have kept that box until today, because sometimes things that no one claims still deserve to be remembered. The everlit light on Pearl Street. On Pearl Street, where once the path of boats and rowers with brown leathered hands passed, there's a small attic hidden between 2 damp warehouses. I was once led there by a newspaper boy named Henry, whose gray-blue eyes resembled the winter sky. He told me, "There's an old woman who lives in that attic, and her light has never gone out, not even when storms rage through." We climbed the rotting wooden steps, holding onto a rope instead of a railing, each step heavy as though we were climbing into a distant memory. In the attic, with a low ceiling and leaking roof, there was a room barely big enough for a bed, a wooden table, and an oil lamp. The woman in that room had a face wrinkled like the bark of an old elm tree, but her eyes were strangely bright, as if she had seen things the world had never dared to face. She told me that since 1693, That lamp had been lit waiting for a husband who went to sea and never returned. I light it every night, she said, her voice soft as smoke, not to guide him back, but to let him know I'm still here. I was silent. The room had no windows, no calendar, no sounds from the street. Only the dim light from that small lamp burning whale oil, its scent strong and solitary. They say the old woman's light never went out. When she passed, the people of the street took turns bringing oil. No one dared to extinguish the flame, and no one knew her name. They just called it the waiting light. Some people leave but never truly vanish, and some lights burn forever just to keep a promise never spoken. The Tavern of the Silent Traveler. Deep in a narrow alley near the East River, where only those who have been lost can find the way out, there is a nameless tavern. The rusty iron sign hangs crookedly, creaking every time the wind blows. I was led to it one autumn night by an Irish coachman when the rain poured down heavily and my legs no longer wanted to move. The tavern had only one owner and no one knew his name. They called him the Silent Traveler, not because he couldn't speak, but because he chose silence ever since his wife and children died in a fire on Broad Street. He didn't speak, he only poured a glass of thick brown beer with the smell of burnt barley and oak bark. People came in, sat, drank, and told stories. There were no prices. You could drink as much as you wanted, but when you left, you had to leave behind a piece of memory in the form of a story or something that reminded you of it. On the walls were hundreds of nameless things, an old handkerchief, a photo burned at the edges, a pocket knife engraved with the words, "My mother." I also left something, a silver button from the father I never met, which my mother had kept as proof that he had once existed. When I turned to leave, the tavern keeper was still standing there, wiping a glass with an old, worn-out cloth. No one saw him sleep, no one saw him eat, but every night the tavern's light was still on, the beer still flowed, and the stories continued. Some places are not meant for those in a hurry. They hold the fragments of lost souls, not to be reassembled, but to remind us that we once existed. The final melody at Bowling Green. It was the first night of December, 1701. The wind from the Hudson River carried a biting cold, and the snow began to fall not in a rush, but quietly, as if the sky was mourning with the earth. I passed through Bowling Green Park, where the summer grass was now just a thin, opaque layer of ice under the moonlight. In the middle of the park there was a wrought iron bench. On it sat a young girl, huddled, her hands holding an old mahogany music box. She wore a gray dress, thin cloth shoes, and a scarf woven from silver flax. I remember every detail, for it was one of those rare moments when time seemed to stand still. I approached, she didn't look up, she simply opened the box, turning the small brass key. The melody played, a strange tune, sad like a farewell, familiar like the vague memory of a childhood dream. No one ever taught me the name of that tune, but when I heard it, I knew I had heard it somewhere before, perhaps in my mother's arms or at the dock when I set out to sea. The girl didn't say anything. She only listened to the music until the metal screeched, signaling the end. When the music box fell silent, she closed the lid, set the box on the bench, then stood up and walked away without looking back. I picked up the box. It was heavier than I expected. At the bottom of the box there was a hand-engraved inscription, "Leave it for the next if you still have something to remember." From then on, every winter I returned to Bowling Green, bringing the music box with me. Not to listen, but to remind myself that the quietest melodies are sometimes the final message from a lonely soul. The Silent Pages on Wall Street. I discovered that bookstore on a spring afternoon in 1702, while wandering to avoid a sudden rain shower on Wall Street. The wooden sign had faded, hanging loosely on two rusty chains, with only a few characters still legible, and Son's Antiquarian Books. There was no doorbell. When I pushed open the heavy door, the smell of damp paper, old wood, and a hint of pine resin filled my nose. The interior was dark, lit only by the faint yellow glow of small candles flickering in black brass holders. No one spoke, only the rustling of paper, as if the books themselves were breathing. Perhaps the bookstore had once been a house. A small wooden staircase led up to a mezzanine, where towering stacks of books loomed like cliffs of time. I walked, my fingers lightly brushing the spines, touching titles in Latin, Dutch, and sometimes ancient Hebrew. At the end of the aisle I saw an elderly man sitting behind the counter. He didn't look up as I approached, only slid a dark leather-bound book toward me, without a title. When I took it, he said only one thing in a deep, hoarse voice. "It will open if you knight it no sooner." I took the book back to my room. For many nights I tried to open it in vain. The pages stuck together as if they had never been written. It wasn't until one winter night, when my heart was heavy with longing and doubt, that I flipped the cover one last time. This time it opened. And on the first page was my own name written in faded ink, exactly like the handwriting of my father, whom I had never met. The map of the blind man. I met him on an old oak bench placed under the shadow of an elm tree at the end of Franklin Street. The sky had fallen dark, and the fog from the docks seeped into the alleys, dyeing everything in a cold, ashen gray. The man was completely blind. His eyes were covered with a white film not focused anywhere, yet his hands never stopped moving. In front of him was a flat piece of wood with tiny copper nails affixed in a mysterious order. He was drawing, not with ink, but with memory, with carvings. "Do you know this city changes its shape every time we turn away?" he said, his voice like the wind passing over rooftops. "Every step, every cry of the vendor, they are lines. I just record what was once true." I looked at the dots, the small carved lines, the empty spaces that evoked streets, houses, alleys, basements. He didn't need eyes. Each detail he placed was the result of listening, waiting, of a memory shaped by time. "Why do you do this?" I asked. "Because when no one remembers, this map will be the final witness," he whispered. Then he handed me a small copper nail, its head rounded like a tear. "Place it where you lost the most important thing. The map will keep it for you." I kept that nail for many years, never using it, because I didn't know what I had lost until it was too late. The lantern on Pearl Street. That night the air was heavy, as if the city was holding its breath. Each cobblestone on Pearl Street was still warm beneath my shoes. I stopped in front of a small house, where the red lantern light flickered through the second-floor window like a whispering flame. They called her Maeve, an Irish woman once a wartime nurse, now running a small healing room at the back of her house, though on the street, rumors about her were more than that. Some said she was a witch. Others claimed she talked to the dead. But when I stepped through that door, all I saw were wrinkled, warm hands and moss-green eyes that could see through the wounds in others' hearts. "You're not sick from the cold, but because you've frozen from the inside," she said, without me speaking a word. I sat in the chair by the fireplace. She brewed a pot of herbs, its aroma like the scent of earth after the rain. The space was filled with shadows and glass jars reflecting the pink light of the lantern. Each jar contained something unnamed: silver hair, dried flowers, a handwritten note, even tears that had frozen. "Let the past burn away," she whispered, then flung open the window, letting the wind blow in, swirling the ashes she scattered over the fire. I didn't ask how she knew. I didn't ask why the red lantern still burned every night like a heart that refused to sleep. I only knew that when I left that house, I felt lighter, as if the old, silent things inside me had been softly sung to peace by someone. A night without lights, when the city stops breathing. I remember one night when the rain poured down like a waterfall. The old wooden roofs bent under the weight, and all the oil lamps in lower Manhattan flickered out, not because of the wind, but because of a sudden flood from the harbor, when the water flooded the alleys, the basements, and even the hearts of people. I took shelter under the awning of a closed barber shop with an old Italian man named Signor Bardo, who had once been the governor's barber. He shivered from the cold, from memories, or from something I couldn't guess. In the darkness, he began to speak in a hoarse voice, as if speaking to time, about the night he shaved a strange man who came from the south. He wore a fur coat, black leather gloves, but his hat was a summer straw hat. He asked me, "If you could erase one mistake from your life, which night would you choose?" Bardo said he didn't answer. He just lowered his head and continued shaving. When he looked up, the man had vanished. No footsteps, no door opening. Only the fogged mirror remained, and in it, his own face, aged 10 years. That night when the water receded, I passed by the barber's shop again. The door was wide open. On the mirror there was a message written in raindrops: "Sometimes darkness doesn't need a light to shine." I never forgot that line, because on some nights New York doesn't need electricity, it just needs people to remember. The ships that never left the dock. There's an old pier behind the Fulton Fish Market, where the wood is blackened like coal and the salty, fishy smell lingers like an unfulfilled vow. I spent many nights there, when I had no home, no name, just eyes wide open, staring at the smoky sky and a dream that had yet to take shape. People say there are ships that dock but never leave. No sailors, no cargo, just the bare hulls of ships and the chains creaking in the night wind. I saw one such ship. Its name was the Salome, painted white, with red trim almost completely peeled off. No one knew where it came from. No one had ever seen anyone leave. Curious, one night I climbed aboard. In the cockpit I found a leather-bound diary, handwritten, with green ink that had smeared into strange patterns. There was a passage I still remember word for word. "Anyone who boards this ship without knowing what they seek will forever anchor their soul at the old dock. not because the ship doesn't weigh anchor, but because they will never leave. I put the diary down, turned, and ran. Since then, whenever the wind picks up at the pier, I hear a faint call, "Come aboard just once." It could be the wind, it could be me, or perhaps a part of me still anchored on the Salome. Bowling Green, where justice wears a bloody coat. I never thought I would witness an execution. But in New York in 1700, there were days when death didn't happen behind closed doors. It took place in Bowling Green Square before hundreds of eyes as a ritual of social order, or rather, a blood-stained spectacle. I still remember the man who was bound that day, a red-haired man wearing a gray shirt, his eyes darkened as if he had never slept. What was his crime? Stealing bread and assaulting a guard in a moment of desperate hunger. But what I couldn't forget was the child, his son, standing in the crowd, clutching the hem of his mother's skirt, not understanding what was about to happen. The executioner stepped forward. A drumbeat sounded monotonous, cold, like the heartbeat of power. The father didn't struggle. He raised his head, looked his son straight in the eyes, and said something I couldn't hear. But I saw it, his lips moving. "I won't abandon you." The axe fell. No one said a word, but I knew we all felt we had just lost something bigger than a life. Perhaps it was humanity, perhaps it was justice. Or maybe it was the soul of this city, being severed piece by piece every time the crowd applauded. The violin's voice in the dark alley. Not every moment in New York in 1700 was tainted with blood or silence. There were nights when the wind blew through the cracks in the old brick walls, and I would hear music. I discovered it in a dark alley near Stone Street, where dilapidated taverns crowded together under flickering oil lamps. The sound, delicate, sorrowful, came from behind the old fabric curtain that concealed the entrance to a small room. I stopped, my heart tightening. A man sat there, black skin, thin frame, holding a wooden violin. He didn't sing. He just played as if each note was a crack in his heart being slowly mended by the wind. He looked at me, not surprised, not inviting. He simply nodded as if he had known I would come. I sat down on the wooden crate beside him. No one spoke. We were there, two strangers, connected by a language without words. I didn't know where he came from, what he did for a living. All I knew was that his music opened doors to memories I had long kept closed. My mother teaching me to read by candlelight, my little brother playing by the creek, lost laughter and cold hands. When he played the final note, New York returned to the sound of horses' hooves and the scent of damp ash. But I was different, as if I had been revived, even if just for a moment. I never saw him again, but every time the street is quiet at night, I long to hear that violin again, like a silent promise that here, there is still a soul. The attic of the Van Hout family. I had no place to stay when I first arrived in New York. All I had were tired feet and scratched hands from clinging to the cold planks of the dock. I lived off the kindness of strangers, and among them, no one left a mark on my heart like the Van Hout family. They were a Dutch family living in a shabby wooden attic on Broad Street. Mr. Van Hout was a candle maker, and his wife raised 6 children in a space barely big enough for 3 adults. I clearly remember the first time I stepped in, the smell of beeswax, burning wood, and raw flour blended into a strange fragrance that I later remembered every time the wind changed. No one asked who I was, no one needed to know where I came from. Mrs. Van Hout simply gave me a bowl of thick porridge, an old blanket, and told me to sleep near the fireplace. The children rearranged themselves and gave me a small corner on the straw mattress. That night, for the first time in many days, I slept without curling up from the cold. In that low attic, I learned greater lessons than those taught in books. I learned how to slice bread to share with everyone, how to use one candle to light the way for 3 people to read, and how to remain silent when someone in the house was sad. Once Mr. Van Hout put his hand on my shoulder and said in his broken English mixed with Dutch, "You don't need to be flesh and blood to be called family." I couldn't respond, my throat tightened, perhaps because no one had ever said such words to me before. I only stayed there one winter, but that place, with all its humble, sincere warmth, became the foundation for what I later called home. The first snow of the season at Bowling Green. The first snow of the season always has a unique taste, not because it is snow, but because it is the first. Like the first glance from a stranger that will become a soulmate, like the first handshake signaling an unpredictable beginning. That year, the snow fell on a quiet morning while I was standing in Bowling Green Square. The trees were bare, the wooden fences were covered in a thin layer of mist, and the cobblestones began to change color with each layer of white ice. I saw the first sleds glide down Broadway, pulled by horses wrapped in woolen blankets with drivers in buffalo leather coats. They were transporting rum, tobacco, and wooden crates filled with popcorn and pine nuts, cargo from the port. On each cart were untold stories, eyes furtively exchanging glances with those waiting at the docks. I had once thought that Bowling Green was just an empty space between streets, but that first snow morning I realized it was a meeting point for merchants, workers, travelers, and sometimes for those who didn't belong anywhere just like me. I stood there, my hands deep in my woolen coat, watching a black woman wearing a cloth hat pass by. She carried a portable iron stove and a pot of corn soup. Her eyes were tired, but her brief cry in the cold air lightened my heart. Hot bowl, 2 cents, warms the heart. No one looked at her, but I stepped closer, handed her the last coin I had, without asking for the soup. I just need to hear your voice, I said. She smiled. A smile that no one saw, but one I would remember until my hair turned gray. The silence of the crowd. I don't know what led me to that street corner that morning. Perhaps it was the sound of the horse's horn, or the unusual gathering of people in the southern field near the fish market. But I distinctly remember the feeling in my heart, as though my steps were being pulled there by an invisible hand of history or conscience. An auction. Not the usual auction for rum, wood, or barrels of sugar from the West Indies, but for people. 3 black people, 2 men and 1 woman, were bound by coarse hemp ropes, standing on a makeshift wooden platform. On their chests were numbered tags. On their faces was silence, a silence so harsh that I felt guilty for every breath I took. The woman was dressed in a brown dress, her head wrapped in a gray scarf, not old, but looking as though she had lived through hundreds of winters. The child beside her, who I guessed was about 8 years old, stood motionless, not shedding a single tear, not crying, not because they were strong, but because they didn't know what crying would accomplish. The auctioneer's voice rang out, hurried like the sale of barley. Strong, able to work in the field, female, knows cooking, knows birthing. The boy is quick, healthy. The crowd was silent, no one protested, no one asked questions, they just watched, they listened to the price. I stood there in the crowd, my hand tightly gripping the worn woolen hat, unable to speak a word. I wondered if I cried out, would anyone hear? If I pushed to the front, would anyone follow? I did nothing, and that is the haunting memory that still lingers to this day. When the rain started to fall lightly, the wooden platform became slippery, and the woman bowed her head. The child turned its head, searching for a gaze, any gaze that would see it as a human being. I didn't offer that gaze. The nameless ones under Broad Street. That winter arrived early. The wind from the Hudson River not only carried a biting cold, but also the scent of ashes and damp salt from the long days of burning firewood. I found shelter in a basement under Broad Street, once a former wine cellar of a Dutch merchant, now a gathering place for the homeless, the stateless, the nameless. They were refugees from Palatinate, a region in Germany devastated by war and religion. They came here on narrow boats, leaving behind villages and the graves of their ancestors, hoping to find some hope in a new world still soiled. In that basement I lived with them, sleeping on burlap sacks, sharing bowls of bland turnip soup, and listening to their whispers at night. Stories no one asked for, but everyone needed to tell. An old woman with hands that always trembled told me about her son, who had perished in the Baltic Sea. A young man with a gloomy gaze occasionally sang hymns in German, his voice deep, as if echoing from a place far away. No one called each other by name, they called each other by memory, the mother, the net maker, the painter. I learned many things from them, not through words but through their endurance, through how they shared each bit of warmth, each piece of bread, each moment of sacred silence like a prayer. In that underground place where the fire burned with bark and hope, I realized, sometimes what binds people together is not a nation or language, but the ability to survive without resentment. On New Year's Eve that year, one of the refugees, an older man named Elias, placed his hand on my shoulder and said in broken English, "New York doesn't know who we are, but we will live, and that is enough." I will never forget that night, when I sat among the nameless ones in the cold earth, and felt my heart warm for the first time in many months of drifting. The Blind Woman and the Bookstore Without a Sign. I discovered that bookstore one early spring afternoon when the city was still sluggish in the gray of melting snow. There was no sign, no doorbell, just a weathered wooden door ajar, as if waiting for a passerby to step in. Inside, it was darker than I expected. The space seemed to be made of the very smell of old paper, the scent of hundreds of years hidden beneath dust and silence. The bookshelves reached the ceiling, crooked but still standing firm, like forgotten pillars of memory. In the middle of the room, sitting on a cracked leather chair, was a blind woman. She didn't look up when I entered. Her eyes were closed, and her hands gently glided over the spines of the books, as if playing a song I could not hear. She didn't need to look. It seemed she remembered every book, every line, every fragment of time. I greeted her. She merely smiled, as if she had heard me coming long ago. "What would you like to read about?" Her voice was husky, but warm like charcoal. I didn't know how to answer. She asked again, "Your own past, or the memories of those who have never been remembered?" I chose the latter. She handed me a small notebook, its dark leather cover unmarked. I opened it. There were no words, only blank pages. "Why is there nothing?" I asked. "Because they haven't been written yet. Those memories you have to listen to and then write them yourself," she replied. From that day on, I often returned. I didn't just read, I learned how to listen, listening to the silences between the lines, the drops of ink falling, the breaths of the paper. She taught me that memories aren't in the words, but in how we pause when we read them. The blind woman never asked my name. I never asked hers. We were two strangers, meeting in a room with no light, learning how to see through memory. The storm and the pastor who lost his faith. That night the wind howled like a wild beast. On my way back from the southern harbor, a sudden downpour came, as if the sky had been torn apart by someone. I had no coat with me. My clothes soaked through, the cold seeping into my skin, piercing all the way to the bone. I sought shelter and found only one house with light, a red brick chapel half broken. The door was unlocked. I stepped inside, leaving small water stains on the cold stone floor. The smell of rotting wood and extinguished candles filled the air. There was no hymn, no one kneeling to pray. Only one man wearing an old black cassock, sitting alone before the broken altar, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on his face, which was far older than his years. He didn't turn when I entered. "Are you afraid of God?" His voice was hoarse, heavy as stone. "I don't know," I answered truthfully. "Neither do I, not anymore." He smiled, but not a joyful smile, more like a sound that came from a throat long familiar with silence. I sat down on the pews, keeping a distance. He began to speak without waiting for me to ask. He had once been a young pastor, believing in the light in redemption, but that year a plague swept through the eastern slums. They prayed one by one, and then one by one they died. No one survived. I watched them die, their hands reaching out to me, and God was silent. After that, he gave up his holy duties, but did not leave the chapel. Because if I no longer believe, who else will remain here to listen to the doubts of people like you and me? That night we sat in silence until the rain eased. We didn't speak again. We were just two people seeking shelter from the storm, one who once believed in heaven and one who was learning how to believe in himself. I left the chapel as dawn broke, but from then on, whenever the wind blows strong, I remember him, the pastor who lost his faith but still kept the chapel door unlocked. Memory for rent. New York in 1700 had those who survived in ways that seemed impossible to exist. I first met him in a basement bar, located behind the Bowery Fish Market. No sign, no windows, only a thick curtain of smoke and the broken sound of a three-stringed violin. They called him the Memory Seller. He sat alone, always with a strong drink, as if holding onto unspoken longing. His face was gray, his eyes never looking at anyone but seemingly always searching for someone. When I asked, "What do you do for a living?" he answered, "I sell memories. Imaginary ones. No real memories for those who have no past or don't want to remember." A widow who lost her husband in the war came to rent him to recount 10 years of happiness she never had. An orphan child sat in silence for hours just to listen to an afternoon that never existed, where it was held by a mother with no name. He told the stories as if he had lived a full life within those memories. I asked, "And do you believe in them?" He smiled. "I don't need to believe. I just need to remember well enough for others to believe for me." I stayed at that bar longer than usual. That night he told me about a wooden house by the Hudson River, where a boy once learned to play the harmonica in the golden afternoon sun. He said, "That never happened, but if you still remember it tomorrow morning, then maybe it was real." I don't know if he was an artist, a conman, or a lonely spiritualist, but I know he had a gift or a curse to make others remember something they had never lived through. And I too carried a piece of the story he told, like everyone who had ever sat before him in that windowless bar. The candle on the unnamed grave. One January afternoon, the snow fell thickly, like dreams yet to be awakened. I walked past the Trinity Cemetery, where the stones had been worn down by time to the point of losing their names, leaving only cold cracks and moss-covered fog. There I saw a man standing silently beside a grave with no inscription. In his hand was a small, flickering candle, the flame trembling in the winter wind. His figure was thin, his back slightly bent, his eyes seemed drained of life, yet within them there was still something alive, perhaps love or an unnamed regret. I asked, "Are you waiting for someone?" He didn't look at me, only answered as if speaking to the wind. She never came back, but every year on this day I still come. I fell silent. I continued. In 1704 she disappeared during a stormy night. No one found her body, no trace was left, but I buried a candle here, and every year I replace it with another, because I believe that if her soul is still lost, this light will guide her. I looked at the small candle before me, burning with a fragile light that any gust of wind could extinguish, and I thought to myself, perhaps every candle in the city is a finger from the past, trying to touch what could not be held onto. The man did not ask my name, and I did not ask where he was from. Some stories don't need to be complete, they just need to exist at the right time, in the right place, like a prayer in the middle of the white snow. When I left, I turned back. He was still standing there, his hand resting on the stone grave, as if holding a conversation that had lasted for 20 years, all through silence. The small attic on Pearl Street. I once rented a small attic on Pearl Street, across from a French bakery and next to an old newspaper printing shop. The room was just large enough to fit a loose wooden bed, an oak writing desk, and the only window that opened to the dull gray sky of February. It was here that I met the matchstick girl. Every late afternoon, when the city began to fill with smoke, the girl would walk past the street, holding an old wooden box filled with small bundles of matches. No one noticed, no one bought. I had often seen her standing for long periods in the snow, gazing into the bakery shop where the glowing oven light shone like a dream never to be reached. One evening I went out, offered her a cup of hot tea, and asked, "Why don't you go home?" She smiled, a sad and sincere smile, like a child used to silence. "I still have to wait." "Wait for whom?" "Wait for the person to receive the letter." I was surprised. In her hand was a bundle of old papers, densely written with brown ink. The letters had no envelopes, no addresses. When I picked one up to read, I realized they weren't letters being sent, but prayers, each letter a story. A mother who lost a child, a soldier who never returned, a husband who never came back through the door. "I write for those who can't write," she said. "They told me to put them on the church window sill. Maybe God will read them." I had never believed in anything for long, but that night, watching the child kneel to place the letters on the cold stone steps of Trinity Church, I felt something stir within me, small, like a spark in my chest, where I thought it had long gone out. The next morning I didn't see her anymore. The matchbox had been blown over by the wind near the porch. As for the letters, I saw people passing them along, then quietly placing them on altars, on windowsills, and on hearts. The attic on Pearl Street remained damp and cold, but for me, it had been the place where a child wrote a miracle with matchsticks and crooked writing, something no one else in the city could do. The Old Woman and the Raven at Seaport. I still remember that winter, when the wind from the Hudson River howled through the gray wooden rooftops, making even the rotting doors shudder. In a narrow alley near the Seaport Market, there was a solitary house, completely detached from the shouting vendors and the noisy clamor of the trading district. In that house lived a blind old woman. No one knew her real name. The children called her Mrs. Whisper because her voice always sounded as though she were whispering into the void. She had only one companion, a large black raven. Its wings spread like the shadows of the night, and the strange thing was, it knew how to call out the names of the dead. I once heard it speak, only once. I was waiting for the rain to subside under her porch. The raven landed on her shoulder, tilted its head, and croaked. Henry Caldwell, 38 years old, died in the stone well. I shuddered. I knew that name, a shoemaker who lived at the end of Nassau Street, missing since last fall. No one had found his body. No one understood why he disappeared. But when I asked the old woman, she just smiled, not the smile of a mad person, but as if everything had been clear for a long time, and it was only us who refused to see it. The townspeople said she could hear the voices of souls, that the raven was the messenger, the one who carried the final words left unsaid, the regrets not yet formed, and the names that were about to vanish. I didn't believe it until another afternoon. I returned, bringing a silver coin, a gift of thanks, as was the custom in those days. She didn't accept it. She just told me to sit down and said to the raven, "Say it, Henry." The raven looked at me. Below where the broken bricks are, the soft earth, the vapor. I froze. 3 days later, Henry's body was found under the ground, behind the old brick kiln, the very spot where I used to stand as a child, playing hide and seek with my brother. I never returned to that house, but every time I passed the seaport area and heard the raven on the roof of a tall wooden house, I wondered, has my name ever been called by the raven? The chapel in the forest. There was a time in my life when I lived like a hermit, not by choice, but because there was nowhere else to go. In the northern part of New York, beyond the trails covered with decayed leaves, there was a dense forest where winter arrived earlier and silence reigned like the final breath of the dying. In the middle of that forest stood an old chapel, the roof slanted, the bell tower broken, the altar covered in dust and cobwebs. People said a French priest once lived there in seclusion, preaching to the sinners, the outlaws, the lawless ones, or simply souls rejected by the world. I came there in winter. The wind howled through the cracks in the door, snow piled thick on the altar, and in the corner of the room were a group of 6 people, each different, yet with one thing in common: they did not want to be found. I didn't ask where they came from, they didn't ask me either. In that world, identity was a luxury. We existed not because of our name, but because of the breath left in the cold. Each night, under the flickering candlelight, we gathered by the fire. An old man told stories. He had been a priest, or had pretended to be one, I don't know. But his voice had something that made me believe he knew more than he said. He spoke of sin not to punish, but to forgive, he said. The cost of sin is not in punishment, but in memory where it repeats, never letting us rest. I slept on the cold stone floor, ate bread as hard as rock, drank water from melted snow, but it was the most peaceful time I had ever known. Then one morning I woke up and they were all gone. No sound, no trace, the house was empty. The door was still ajar like the night before, the fireplace still holding a little ash. There was only one new carving on the wooden door. The one who survives is not the strongest, but the one who can forgive themselves. I left that morning and never returned, but there are nights when sleep won't come, and I find myself sitting in that chapel among the nameless and hearing that man's voice like a prayer never spoken aloud. The Boy and the Goose Feather. Pearl Street back then was not like it is now. No skyscrapers, no streetlights, only cramped attics where the sound of footsteps blended with the wind. I rented an attic room for cheap because it had almost no windows, a leaky ceiling, and the musty smell crept into my sleep. I made my living by transcribing ledgers for an old Dutch merchant, writing long pages of trade records every day with black ink and rough paper. My hands became calloused, but my mind gradually drifted into a tranquility I had never known before. One October morning, when the maple leaves turned yellow on the wooden steps, I saw a boy sitting at the foot of the stairs. His face was smeared with dirt, and he held a bundle of dry twigs in his arms, his eyes wide as he stared at the goose feather I was holding. He didn't say a word, just watched. The next day he came again, and the day after that. On the 5th day I handed him a piece of paper and the goose feather. He took it, shook his head. I placed his hand on the paper and we wrote together. A, the first letter of every name. Every morning before I worked, I taught him a letter. He learned quickly, not by speaking, but with his eyes and hands. By the end of the winter, he could write his own name, Elias. I never asked who his parents were. He never asked where I came from. Our relationship was like the writing, each stroke a result of silence, patience, and unspoken trust. Then spring came. On a drizzly morning, I left Elias a small cloth-bound notebook with handwritten lessons, how to write, how to read, how to keep calm when the world is too big. When I left Pearl Street to board a ship north, Elias was no longer sitting at the foot of the stairs. But I knew that somewhere he was still writing, maybe letters, maybe poetry, or simply his own life. There are people you meet only once, but they stay with you like a bold letter in the long passage of fate. I left Pearl Street when the ice melted, as the seagulls returned to the gloomy sky, and the cracking sound of the Hudson River echoed like a whisper from the past. I was hired as a cargo recorder for a sailing ship carrying agricultural goods from the northern estates to Fulton Market. The ship was called Hope's Wake, its sails yellowed like an old letter that had never been sent. On board was an older man, Mr. Pierre, of French origin, quiet with eyes that seemed covered by a veil of mist. He He didn't speak much, but I noticed that every time the ship passed the rocky part of the river near Sleepy Hollow, he would always look towards the forest without blinking. One night when the ship anchored to avoid a heavy downpour, I heard him muttering in the dark. It was there, every time we pass I hope to see the trace again, but the forest only returns silence. I didn't understand what it was, but that night when I went up on deck to check the cargo, I saw a flickering light at the edge of the forest. A pale blue light like a will-o'-the-wisp. I called for Mr. Pier, but all I saw was his cloak hanging on the wooden post. We searched all night, no footprints, no sound, only the old spyglass he always carried lying next to a puddle. The next morning we had to leave, the cargo couldn't be delayed, but I knew that from then on the ship had lost a part of its soul. Every time the ship returned to the Hudson, I would look toward the forest just like Mr. Pier used to do, and it seemed to me that I understood that some souls don't disappear, they simply choose where they want to belong. Death in Stone Alley. When night falls over the southern district, where narrow stone alleys stretch like forgotten pathways of a graveyard, there was an incident that the locals never wanted to talk about. But I, in this chain of memories, must tell it, for it changed the way I see New York forever. I was living temporarily in a wooden attic next to Stone Alley, a dark passage between two old brick houses, once the path of Dutch shipbuilders. Every night I often heard footsteps, not hurried, not chaotic, but steady steps, as if someone was on patrol, tireless, unwavering. At first I thought it was the guard, but in the darkness, with no lights, New York in 1700 rarely had anyone guarding anything except the church or the market. Then one April morning the body of Maren, a young Swedish seamstress, was found at the end of the alley. Her face was calm, as if she were sleeping. No signs of struggle, no blood, just a neatly folded handkerchief placed on her chest and a line of red thread stitched into it. Only those who listen to the footsteps of memory will understand what has passed. No one recognized the phrase except for the old man who washed bodies for the nearby church. He said it was a phrase often sewn onto burial shrouds, in a small monastery in Bergen, where he had lived when he was young. Maren's death was never explained. The police, if you could call them that, gave up after a few weeks. But since then, Stone Alley no longer had footsteps at night. Instead, there was complete silence, so heavy that I had to leave the attic without packing anything. On the last night before I left, I heard a knock on the door, 3 soft taps. When I opened it, I only saw the old handkerchief on the windowsill, this time with one more line stitched. You have listened, so never forget. The night of white snow and young Ilias. It was a December night, and to this day I still feel the chill that seeps into my bones whenever I think back. The snow fell thick like the morning veil of the earth, blanketing Hanover Square, a place once bustling with traders, children, and mothers busy with their water and milk baskets. Young Ilias was one of those children, the son of Mora, a widow from Ireland who lived next door to me. Ilias was slender, with golden hair like summer hay, but his eyes were as deep as the North Sea, filled with unspoken things. He often played alone in the corner of the square, with a wooden top that his late father had carved by hand before he departed this world on a ship that never returned. That afternoon, Ilias left home earlier than usual. He told his mother he wanted to find a quiet place to listen to the snow fall. A seemingly innocent statement, but it would later haunt the whole neighborhood. That night, while everyone else was gathered by their fires to keep warm, Mora frantically ran from door to every porch, searching for her little boy. No one had seen Ilias since the afternoon. I, along with a few other men, took lanterns and scoured the square, inspecting every corner, every step, and every frozen bush. We found tiny footprints leading out of the square, then they disappeared at the edge of the small forest behind the old church. Next to the footprints was the wooden top, neatly placed on a snow-covered stone, and a folded piece of paper with scribbled yet clear handwriting. I have gone to find the place that Father promised, a place where the wind does not blow and the snow is not cold. Ilias never returned. Some said he got lost and couldn't survive the night. Others, the older ones, said that some doors only open once, for those with hearts pure enough to walk through. Mora kept the top on a small altar in her house. Every year, on the first snowy night, she would place a small piece of bread and whisper something in Gaelic, a lullaby to send her child off into a world where only love can hear. The Woman in Purple and the Nameless Funerals. I still remember that cold morning, a heavy January morning when the fog settled like a thin layer of ash on the street's cobblestones. Trinity Church, located on Wall Street, was quieter than usual. The sound of the bell echoed through the thin mist, lingering like a farewell that would never end. That day's funeral was for an unknown man, a sailor who had drifted to the docks with no papers, no family, no farewell words. His body was discovered by the liquor merchants after a heavy storm, and as usual, Father Whitaker held a simple burial for the lonely souls. But what stayed with me and with many others wasn't the dead man, but the living woman. Among the scattered empty seats she appeared, a tall, thin woman standing straight like a street lamp, draped in a deep purple cloak, a color no one would wear at a funeral except for royal families or those carrying a curse. No one knew where she came from. She quietly sat in the back row, her hands folded together, her eyes closed, lips moving as if praying in a language no one understood. When the priest began the final prayer, I saw her pull out from her cloak a small piece of cloth, purple like her cloak, and place it on the simple wooden casket. The cloth was embroidered with a flying swallow, soaring through dark clouds. A quiet gesture, but from then on she appeared at every nameless funeral in the city. Whether rain or shine, day or night, the woman in purple always came, always sat silently at the back, and always left behind a piece of purple cloth with different embroidery. Some say she lost her whole family at sea. Others say she is the embodiment of the goddess Morana, who escorts souls to the afterlife. As for me, she became a part of the city, like the wind through alleys, like the bells on the tower, like the whispers in the deep graves. And from that day I never looked at funerals as a parting, but as an invitation to somewhere where the purple cloths still flutter in the nameless sky. The blind man who raids the city. On the second floor of an old bookstore tucked away on Pearl Street, there is a small room hidden behind a shelf of rotting oak bookshelves. This room was where I used to go on winter afternoons, not for the light, but for the darkness. In that darkness, there was a blind man who recited the history of New York from memory, with his heartbeat and a voice that made you forget he had never seen the light. His name was Elias Finch. Everyone in the neighborhood called him the man who recites the past. He had never been to school, nor had he ever left that attic, but somehow he knew every street, every brick, every storm, every major fire in the past 50 years. They said he used to be a wandering boy, taken in and raised by an old teacher who taught him to read by feeling maps, touching street bricks with his fingers, and learning to listen to what the walls of the city had to say. "Bricks remember longer than people do," he once said. I remember the first time I visited him out of curiosity. I stepped into the small room where the walls were covered in leather maps and every book was arranged by smell, the smell of old dust, mildew, printer's ink. Elias sat there, facing a closed window, as if light still passed through that narrow crack, though his eyes had been blind since birth. "What do you want to know?" he asked, his voice deep, like the sound of wooden wheels rolling on stone. I replied, "About a New York that's lost." He chuckled hoarsely. "This city has never been lost, it's just speaking in a language that young people no longer have the patience to listen to." And then he began, night after night, hour after hour. Elias Finch recited in a voice like moss growing on ancient stones, about the nights when snow covered Broadway, about the murmurs of Dutch people praying in wooden churches, about the wrecked ships lying under what is now William Street. Every night he conjured the city not through pictures, but through the rhythm of each sentence, through the silence between two sighs. I listened and then wrote it all down, not to preserve it, but to remind myself that some people, though they have never seen the light, still show the way for a whole city to pass through the darkness. Under the bakery awning. It was a rainy December night. The east wind came rushing in, blowing along the wooden rooftops, creeping into every crease of clothing, making one shiver not from the cold, but from memories. I found shelter under the awning of a small bakery near the Fulton docks. The glass was fogged with moisture, and the faint glow of the oven light was visible behind the curtains. But what attracted me wasn't the smell of freshly baked bread, but the voice that echoed from the darkness, where two figures sat, leaning against the damp wooden wall. An old Jewish man wearing a worn wool hat, holding a wooden staff smoothed by generations. Next to him was a young black boy, thin, barefoot, huddled with a torn cotton scarf. They didn't notice me, and I didn't speak. I stood still, listening to their conversation, not to interrupt, but as though I were hearing two eras conversing. "Are you afraid?" the boy asked. "Afraid of what?" "Afraid of people forgetting you, forgetting everything you ever did." The old man chuckled softly, the sound like a wooden wheel rolling on a cobblestone street. "Son, people will always forget, but what matters is, do you remember?" The boy looked up at him as if trying to understand something bigger than himself. "I don't know what's worth remembering. I don't have anything special." "You survived," the old man replied. "You're breathing, that's a kind of miracle." That answer resonated in me like a small bell quietly ringing in the rain. They spoke of forgiveness, not forgiving others, but forgiving oneself. for the days we ran away, the times we stayed silent, and the things we can no longer change. I stood there for nearly an hour until the old man stood up, placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, and said, "You'll grow up and pass through this city like a ghost, unless you choose to live as someone who knows how to remember." The rain began to ease. They left, their silhouettes disappearing behind the mist. I stayed there, feeling as if something had just been washed away inside me. Not by their conversation, but by the silence within me. For the first time, I forgave a part of the memory that had always haunted me. The threshold no one walks through. There was a man who lived at the end of Stone Street, near the old sawmill area. They called him McCullen, an Irish shoemaker who once had a small shop nestled between two dark wooden houses. That shop had been destroyed in the Great Fire of 1699, when the flames spread from the kitchen of a tavern all the way to the riverbank. Everything was reduced to ash. But every morning, regardless of rain or shine, he would go there, bend down, and carefully wipe a doorstep that no longer existed. There was no door, no sign, no customers, just him and the memories. I once thought he was mad, until one winter morning I sat on the opposite porch, holding a steaming cup of coffee, and watched him do the thing that no one else cared about. He wiped each edge of the step as though it were a sacred ritual. When I approached and asked, "Why do you still do this?" he didn't answer immediately. He just looked at me with a seasoned gaze, then said, "This is where my son first learned to tie his shoelaces. It's where my wife would wait each evening to walk home with me. It's where I laughed, where I sang. It may not be here anymore, but I am still here." He looked down at the empty step, then continued, "If we don't wipe away the dust, the memories will be buried, and one day we won't remember what we lived for." I left when the sun rose above the mast. The cold wind brushed against my collar, but my heart suddenly felt warm, perhaps because I understood. Memories don't need brick walls or wooden planks to reside. They just need someone brave enough to preserve them day after day, even when no one is left to stop and look. The woman at Broad Square. Every evening, as the sun begins to cast long shadows over the low-roofed houses of Broad Square, people would see her standing there, small and frail, her hands stained with cornmeal, her eyes gazing into the distance as if waiting for someone from a past life. They called her Mama Elsie. She wasn't old, but neither was she young. No one knew her true age. Some said she had been a slave who escaped from the South. Others swore she had been a personal cook in a Dutch noble's household, then ran away with a white lover, but no one really knew for sure. The only thing she carried with her each day was a tiny clay stove, a wicker basket, and a piece of cloth containing warm cornmeal cakes, smelling of burnt butter and cinnamon. I often silently went to buy one, not because I was hungry, but because she always told stories. Not the kind of stories one tells children, but fragments of memories, pieces from a time that no one talks about anymore, a time when a black woman could not stand in the middle of the square without being beaten, without being stared at as an object out of place. She spoke of the husband who never returned, the man who promised to meet her at this very corner when the war ended. She spoke of the day they hung a sign reading "No sales to black people" on the grocery store. And she told of the first night she dared to step into the square, carrying her stove as a declaration, "I am alive, and I am free." One day I asked, "Why do you still wait here after all these years?" She only smiled, took out a yellowed letter from her pocket, the ink faded with time. It was the last letter from her husband, with the final line, "If I am still alive, I will return to the same place, where there is the smell of popcorn and the warmest hands I ever held." She looked up at the evening sky and whispered, "Maybe that day will never come, but if I'm not here, who will welcome him back?" I took a bite of the cornmeal cake, feeling my heart become heavier than the burnt cornmeal. Some waits are not for hope, but for love, the kind of love that makes you stand in the square for 30 years, just so you don't miss a single moment, the moment when your loved one returns. The words behind Trinity Church. If you ever wander south along Wall Street, where Trinity Church stands proudly against the biting west winds, you might not notice an old stone wall behind it. The surface of the wall is dotted with green moss, cracked over the years as if it has endured centuries of silent prayers. But if you bend down close to the base of the wall, near where the old, rusted iron fence casts its shadow on the damp grass, you will see small, faded engravings, still legible when the afternoon sun casts its slanting light. "Father, if you can, please come back this way." I discovered this inscription one autumn morning when I was still a young man working odd jobs for the minister at the church. I remember that day the wind was strong, yellow leaves swirling around my feet as I was sweeping outside, and I saw the carving. It felt as if a thread had pulled me back in time, and I sat down, running my fingers over each letter. The old minister who had a memory like a treasure chest told me, that inscription dates back to the 1712 riots. The writer was a young boy, about 12 years old, named Eli. The boy's father, a French printer, disappeared during the chaotic night when a slave rebellion rose up against the oppression. The whole city was plunged into fear, and many innocent people were mistakenly arrested, tortured, and disappeared forever in stone cells or underground. Eli didn't know whether his father had died or where he had been imprisoned. Every evening after working at a small bakery on Stone Street, he secretly brought an iron spike with him, then carved each letter into the wall, one stroke each day, for almost 3 months. "Father, if you can, please come back this way." It wasn't a cry for help, it was a direction, a small door in the soul of a child who never gave up hope. I don't know if the father ever saw those words, but I do know one thing: each time someone reads it, as I did, that hope comes back to life just a little. And in this ever-changing city, perhaps the most essential things are these small pieces, pieces of longing, pieces of hope, pieces left behind for one another in the darkness. The mute man under the overpass. At the foot of the overpass on Market Street, what is now a bustling area used to be a leather craft workshop. No signs, no greetings, just the pungent smell of tanning chemicals, the sound of leather hitting iron hooks, and the figure of a mute man with hands as rough as the winter earth. His name was Saul. No one knew his last name. No one knew where he came from, only that he had been there for as long as anyone could remember. His hair was prematurely gray, his mustache always dark with soot, and his eyes deep, as though they had seen a world that no longer existed. I first met him when I was 17, following a blacksmith who was delivering a pair of pliers to the tanning workshop. Saul didn't speak, but he waved his hand gently, a subtle nod signaling come in. The workshop was dark, damp, the oil lamps flickering over the stretched cowhides on the racks, but what I remember most was not the leather, but the wall inside. That wall was covered with tiny engravings, dense and regular, like history written with fingernails. The other workers told me, "He hasn't spoken since 1707, after the fire on Broad Street." It turned out that Saul was the only one to survive a devastating fire. The blaze started at a printing house late at night, consuming 32 buildings and dozens of lives. At the time, Saul was an apprentice printer, and after that night he never spoke again. But he remembered by carving into the wall every day names of the dead, dates, the last things they left behind. A ring, a phrase, a half-printed book. I remember once touching the wall, and Saul, who never touched anyone, placed his hand on mine. His eyes didn't look at me, but through me, to somewhere I couldn't follow. That man didn't need words. His whole life was a silent hymn of remembrance, but it endured like the carvings that never faded. The forbidden melody. There are nights when the wind blows through the narrow alleys of Water Street as if whispering old stories. That night was one of those nights, in 1709, when the moon set early and the drunks hadn't yet left the table. The tavern was right by the bay, called the Bitter Gull. The walls were made of rough wood, lanterns hung low, and the floor creaked with every step. That night a man walked in, carrying an old violin and a strange, yet familiar face. No one knew his name, but when he lifted the violin, all the noise ceased. There were no greetings, no tips, no introductions. He simply played a mournful melody, like a call from the depths of the sea, like the lament of souls unable to find rest. The tune was unlike any song anyone had heard before. It wasn't folk music, it wasn't a hymn, it wasn't a concert. And when the music finally stopped, the tavern owner, a woman who had lived through 3 great plagues, whispered softly, "That is the forbidden melody." It turned out that melody had once played at the Pearl Street Theater in 1698, on the final night before it was burned down by the wrath of God, as the newspapers had called it. People believed the melody drove the listeners mad. In the 2 weeks following that night, 11 people threw themselves into the river. The man with the violin that night, no one knew where he came from or why he played that tune in the small tavern. But I remember clearly, when the final note played, all of us stood up. No one spoke, no one laughed, we simply walked out of the tavern in complete silence. And the next morning, the Bitter Gull was locked up for good. A small sign hung in front of the door: "Here once was music, and memories we do not wish to recall." The Girl and the Almond Tree. I once lived in a small neighborhood east of Hester Street, where newly arrived Ashkenazi Jews settled, bringing with them Torah books, bagels, and stories that no one believed but no one dared to deny. Among those stories was one I heard in the winter of 1709, when the cold was so intense that candles wouldn't even light in the synagogue. The story begins with an almond tree growing alone in the damp courtyard, behind a red brick house with no number. They say that on every full moon night, especially in the month of Shavat, people would see a young girl emerge from behind the almond tree, in a white nightgown with long hair flowing, eyes tightly closed as if in a sleepwalk. They say she didn't speak. She would walk barefoot through the streets, stopping in front of windows as though listening to each dream. By dawn, she would return and vanish. In the morning, a few strands of black hair would always be caught in the tree's branches, and the ground would be sprinkled with almond blossoms, even in the middle of the cold winter. I didn't believe it until I witnessed it with my own eyes. That night I quietly followed her. Her footsteps made no sound, but the snow beneath my feet kept squeaking, as if the entire neighborhood had rejected me. She walked straight to house number 19, where an old watchmaker was dying from lung disease. She stood there, her hand resting on the doorframe, and I saw him, the old watchmaker, sigh, as if surrendering everything. The next morning they discovered he had passed away, his face peaceful, his hand tightly gripping a small almond branch that had never been in his house before. Since then I've believed that the girl wasn't human, or at least she wasn't human anymore. They named her Layla, which means night in Hebrew. And the almond tree behind the house still blooms on every full moon night, no matter the weather. The white petals fall like snow, and every time I pass by, I slowly bow my head, as if offering a greeting to a soul that still hasn't found peace. The last letter on South Street. I remember that night, the rain pouring down like a torrent, each cold drop piercing through the thick fabric of my old coat. The wind from the East River blew across South Street, where ships waited to depart, carrying goods, hopes, and sometimes the things that had never been spoken. They called him Timothy Crane, a young sailor, his eyes as blue as the summer sea, but his voice deep like someone who had lived through many lifetimes. I met him in a peculiar moment while seeking shelter from the rain under the awning of an old bakery. He was writing, his wet hands trembling, trying to hold the paper down to prevent it from flying away. "For my mother," he said, not looking up. "She doesn't know I'm taking this trip, and I'm not sure I'll be back." I asked why he didn't send the letter through the church like everyone else. He just shook his head. "There are some words that can only be sent by the hands of the living through true memories, not a seal, not a postman." I took the letter, promising to deliver it to the old woman who lived in the wooden house at the end of Mulberry Street, near the small park with only one old swing. That night I watched him board the Sea Rose, waving goodbye one last time, his gaze as quiet as a weak lantern burning in the stormy night. 2 weeks later, they said the Sea Rose had disappeared on its way to Barbados and no one survived. I took the letter to his mother's house, unable to speak. The old woman didn't ask anything. She simply took the letter, pressed it against her chest, and said, "Thank you," for someone still holding on to the last words. Since then, I often went to South Street on rainy nights, not to wait for ships, but to remember a man who chose to write his farewell not with tears, but with words delivered by a stranger's hands with the last hope. The silent melody in the 5 Points Market. There are days when memories return not in images or scents, but in sound and echo that needs no words. And that day, in the bustling 5 Points Market, I heard a melody I could never forget, even though no one sang a single word. The child had no name, or if it did, no one had ever heard it spoken. It couldn't speak, and no one thought it understood the language of adults, but it had a homemade instrument made from scraps of wood and steel wire taken from broken bed frames. Every morning it sat on the steps of a house at the corner of Baxter Street, playing its own tune, unique, unlearned by anyone. The other children would laugh and the adults would avoid it, but on one day when the market was chaotic, with the noise of vendors shouting, arguments, and wheels grinding on stone, suddenly everything stopped. Because that music played not loud, not forceful, but steady like the whisper of the city's soul. Its playing wasn't joyful nor sad, but something in between, as if all the pain of the past and all the loss yet to come were passing through those small hands. An old man with a silver beard, once a musician at the Bowery Theater, shed a tear when he heard it, not out of pity for the child, but because that music reminded him of something no one had ever named in his life. From then on, no one chased the child away. The fishmonger left it a piece of bread and the bartender slipped it a coin, not out of pity, but as a silent way of saying thank you, because for a few minutes, amid the chaos of life, someone had listened to the city and returned a melody to it. I never saw the child again after that winter. Some said it died from a cold, others said it was adopted by a circus troupe, but I still believe that child took its melody somewhere to play for those quiet enough to listen. The Blood Moon Night at the Abandoned Church. I never believed in ghosts. In New York in the 1700s, people didn't have time to fear the unseen when the cold, hunger, and the nature of humanity were enough to kill anyone. But on the blood moon night that year, in the ruins of a church near Broad Street, I saw something that could not be explained. People called it the Old Dutch Chapel, the Old Dutch Church, abandoned since the last days when the city was still called New Amsterdam. Cracks ran along the brick walls, the bell tower had collapsed, but every time the wind rose from the East River, people still heard a sound like the ringing of a bell, lonely, distant, and as cold as a needle piercing into memory. That night the moon was as red as blood. I was looking for shelter as a snowstorm approached, and the old church was the only place left with a roof. I entered, my heart slowing as I smelled the scent of half-burnt candle wax, something that shouldn't be in a place with no visitors for 10 years. And then I saw them. It was unclear whether they were living or spirits, but they stood in a circle, 8 people, wearing black cloaks with wide-brimmed Dutch hats. In each of their hands was a leather-bound book, and from their mouths came whispers in an ancient tongue I had never heard, a ritual, a memory. I held my breath, hiding behind a broken pillar. For a moment I felt as if time had turned back. It was no longer the year 1700, but 1647, when New Amsterdam was still a primitive trading post, and these men were a secret society of Dutch merchants, ones who had sworn to protect a treasure buried beneath this city. The moonlight shone through the broken window panes, casting their shadows on the decaying floor. Suddenly they all raised their heads as if they had heard my breath, and then they vanished. No sound, no footprints, only the leather-bound book left on the floor. I didn't dare touch it. I ran into the night, the snow falling white on my head. But from that day on, every time the moon was red, I still heard the bell. And my heart knew they were still there, not ghosts, but memories that refused to disappear, waiting for someone to listen. The story of the ship that never docked. One summer afternoon, when the sun blazed down on the mudflats of southern Manhattan, I sat beside an old man with silver hair, skin weathered by time, and a face deeply lined like a folded map of a lifetime. People called him Old Jonah, an elderly freed slave who lived by mending fishing nets and telling stories to children in exchange for a few pieces of stale bread. I happened upon him while seeking refuge from the summer heat. He invited me to sit on a moss-covered rock, his hands still smoothing the fibers of the fishing net, his voice slow and deep, as if each word had to be drawn from a memory of the coldest chill. "There was a ship," he began, "that never docked. It left Africa during a dry season, carrying not only bodies but also the cries and souls of those shackled." I listened, my breath merging with the gentle sound of the waves. Jonah told me the ship, called the Widow's Ghost, was filled with slaves, but no one knew where it was headed. It was cursed from the moment it left port, its sails soaked in blood, the bow carved in the shape of a weeping woman. "They say," he lowered his voice, "it appeared in the fog near Battery Wharf and then disappeared. Once, a drunken sailor on Water Street swore he heard crying from beneath the water, a cry that repeated over and over, as if the soul was waiting to step ashore." I asked, "Do you believe it?" He smiled but didn't answer. But behind him I noticed an old object lying on the net basket, a brass bracelet engraved with African symbols. It was so ancient it couldn't belong to this century. And at that moment I realized, perhaps the widow's ghost never docked, but the memory of it still lingers in the hearts of the survivors, in the eyes of the witnesses, in the heart of a city that has forgotten its past. The Lantern Keeper at the end of Pearl Street. At the end of Pearl Street there stood a 3-story wooden house, quietly hidden behind the old oak trees and the musty scent of time. The locals referred to it as the Lantern House, not because it had ever been used to light the way for ships, but because every night, regardless of rain or fog, an oil lamp was always lit in the attic window. The one who lit the lamp was Mrs. Eleanor Mallory, a widow with snow-white hair like the Hudson River and pale blue eyes tinged with the sorrow of someone who had lost her entire world in one fateful winter night in 1702. When I first stepped into her home, the room was filled with the scent of dried lavender and the sound of wood creaking underfoot. She sat by the fireplace, knitting a woolen scarf, her face not smiling but her eyes unusually warm. "Have you heard about that lamp?" she asked, her voice soft like smoke. I shook my head. "It's a promise," she said, "to someone who sailed away and never came back." Her story was a quiet love song. A young lover, Captain Thomas Carrick, left New York aboard the Providence ship to carry goods to Antigua, promising to return by spring. But spring came and went. The first year, she waited in fitful sleep. The second year, she kept the lamp burning every night, a beacon for her lover across the vast ocean. For the next 40 years, she never left the city, never let the lamp go out. Even as war broke out, even as the streets changed, the lamp in her window remained lit, a permanent symbol of undying love, or perhaps the most naive hope in a city that never waits too long for anyone. On the day she passed away, they found her sitting still by the window, the lamp still burning. And strangely enough, that very evening, an unnamed old sailor entered the tavern by the dock and said that he had seen an old ship, its British flag faded, anchored near Governor's Island, and on the bow was engraved the name, Providence. Perhaps love doesn't die. It just drifts far away and one day quietly returns, finding the very lantern that has been waiting for it. The Child in Trinity Cemetery. There is a part of my memory I often avoid, a cold and gloomy morning when my steps led me to the old Trinity Cemetery where gravestones lean between moss and the dust of time. The east wind blew through the oak trees, making a rustling sound like the whispering of souls. There, among hundreds of names etched in stone and remembered, there was a nameless grave, just a small, cold stone with only 2 words engraved: Innocens, the innocent. I stop there whenever I feel an emptiness in my heart. The elderly tell that in 1704 an infant was abandoned at the doorstep of Trinity Church's chapel during a snowstorm. It did not survive the night, no one knew whose child it was, no one took it in, and since then an anonymous wildflower bouquet has been placed there every week by someone unknown. It is said that the soul of the child never left that place. Some nights the cemetery keeper hears faint cries in the wind, or tiny footprints left on the wet earth after rain, even though no one has passed by. Young mothers who have lost their children often come to pray, believing that a little angel is listening to them, a soul that asks for nothing, only to be remembered. I don't know why this place haunts me so much. Perhaps because in this bustling city, that child symbolizes everything forgotten, those who never had a story, never had a name, never experienced love. One day when I returned, I saw a woman standing by that grave, her trembling hands placing an old doll cradle on the ground. She looked at me, her eyes filled with something unspoken. "Do you believe that every soul needs someone to remember them?" she asked. I nodded. "Good," she smiled, "because sometimes memories are what keep us alive, even long after we are gone." The Storm of 1705. South Street, the hub of adventurous voyages and homeward-bound ships, is not just a place where goods are stored, but also a place where untold stories are piled up. There I once met a man with eyes as gray-blue as the sea after a storm, an old sailor living in a small wooden cabin attached to the side of an old ship, where weathered maps hung loosely on the walls. His name was Elias. He couldn't recall his exact age, but he remembered the last time he went ashore was in the spring of 1705, the season of the greatest storm of his life. We left Halifax port on the ship called the Sea Wraith. The wind was favorable, the sails full, and everyone's mind full of hope, he said, flicking ash onto the wooden floor. But the ocean has no memory. It doesn't remember who has passed through. It owes no one anything. 3 days after leaving port, the sky darkened. The wind shifted suddenly. The clouds covered the sky and the ship was caught in a storm with no way out. Waves as high as walls crashed onto the deck. Elias' closest friend, First Mate Dorian, was swept into the sea while tying the mainsail. No one had time to say goodbye. There were no prayers, just a moment, then vanished. That storm didn't just take lives, it took our pride as well, Elias said, his voice choking. I left the ship after that. I didn't sail anymore. But every time the wind shifts, I hear the mast creak, the screams in the rain, as if the sea won't let go. Elias lived alone at the dock, but every day he helped the children tie makeshift sails, taught them to read maps, and told them stories about islands that weren't on official maps. In the stories he told, there was sadness, hope, and a persistent belief that the sea, though indifferent, still held the memory of those who once belonged to it. I stay here, he said to me for the last time, because the ships need someone to tell their stories, even if no one listens anymore. The Violinist at the Broad Street Inn. On a bitter winter night, as the snow began to blanket the old rooftops and the light from the oil lamps cast shadows on the wet cobblestone streets, I found my way to a small inn deep in Broad Street. There were no proper signs, only the faint sound of a violin playing, as if a lost soul was leading the weary to a safe haven at the end of the day. The violinist's name was Amos, a thin man with gray beard, a tattered cloak, and eyes that seemed to have witnessed too much. His music was not the kind for festivals or military marches. It was sad, soft, and still, like slow steps through a graveyard after rain. I asked him why he played music in such a secluded place. He looked up at me, gently drawing the bow across the strings once more, before speaking. Because once, on a night like this, music saved a man from death. It was a story that happened over 10 years ago, when Amos was still a wandering musician living on the streets of Bowery. One evening he encountered a young soldier, curled up on the doorstep, clutching his chest, his eyes vacant as if he had given up. He had just returned from the battlefield in the West Indies, lost his friends, lost his way, and was planning to end his life in solitude. Amos had nothing to offer except his violin. He sat beside the soldier, played an old tune, a melody his mother used to sing when he was a child. The sound of the violin poured into the night like a fragile warmth seeping into a tattered coat. The young soldier did not throw himself into the cold water as he had intended. He sat, listened, and then began to cry. Since then, Amos said, I haven't been able to stop playing, because maybe, somewhere in a dark corner, someone needs to hear a reason to keep going. The sound of the violin continued to fill the inn. With my warm drink in hand, I realized, music is not just sound, it is memory, it is salvation, it is the fragile thread that connects life to what has been lost. The newspaper print shop on Pearl Street. The old newspaper print shop sat nestled between two gray-red brick buildings on Pearl Street. I walked in on a crisp autumn morning when the smell of fresh paper and ink still lingered in the air, as if time had never passed. The old printing press still worked by hand, the clattering sound slow but steady, like the heartbeat of a city slowly waking up. The owner of the shop was Mr. Thackeray, an elderly man wearing a black velvet hat, with reading glasses perched on his nose, and speaking in a gravelly voice that carried the scent of tobacco and history. He told me, "Here we don't just print news, we print hope, print anger, print sorrow. Every letter on the page is a slice of the city's soul." I sat at a weathered wooden table, watching him set type by hand, tiny metal blocks, quietly placed into the frame like a mason building a wall of memories. The first headline I saw that day was about a fire on Water Street 3 days prior, but what stopped me was a reader's letter, a mother searching for her missing child from last year. "My son's name is Samuel. He has a mole on his left cheek, about 10 years old. If anyone sees him, please report to this print shop." Thackeray printed the letter with a solemn expression, as if he had seen thousands of other Samuels lost in the city, never to return. "We print everything," he said, "because every story deserves to be remembered, even if it's just a fragile sliver of hope." As I left the print shop, the words still printed in my mind like shadows cast on the brick wall, clear, upright, but never permanent. In a city that never stops moving, the print shop is where time is preserved, one line, one column, one small piece of what has passed. The old pharmacy on Maiden Lane. I still vividly remember the pungent scent of dried mugwort, dried herbs, and licorice when I stepped into the small pharmacy tucked away on Maiden Lane. The dark wooden shelves were filled with dusty glass jars, each labeled in old cursive handwriting, peppermint oil, cough syrup from elm bark, or crushed ginseng roots. The pharmacist at the time was Mrs. Godwin, a widow with white hair neatly tied at the nape of her neck, with gentle yet stern eyes that seemed to observe you like winter from a window. She didn't just sell medicine, she listened. And in that listening, it seemed as though she took in not only visible wounds, but the invisible ones too. A man entered, hunched over as though his back had borne a lifetime of struggles. "I can't sleep," he said. "I dream of gunshots from 1696. Mrs. Godwin didn't answer immediately. She stepped behind the counter, retrieved a small brown packet. "Lavender, a bit of orange peel, and valerian root," she said, mixing them. "But more importantly, you must let a new dream into your head before closing your eyes." I asked her if she truly believed in the power of these herbs. She answered slowly, "Medicine is half of it, the other half is belief. If you believe that peaceful sleep will come sometimes, it will indeed arrive." In the city back then, where disease and poverty crept through every alley, pharmacies like Mrs. Godwin's were not just places to cure the body, they were also where people went to feel heard, even if only for a few minutes. I left the pharmacy with a small packet of herbal tea, not sure if I would drink it, but certain I had been healed in some way, not by the medicine, but by the way she looked into my eyes, as if I was worth saving. A small wedding by the river. I still remember that morning when the mist hadn't lifted from the water and the early light was as pale as an unfinished memory. The small stone church sat quietly at the end of Peck Slip, facing the East River, where boats still came and went, carrying the scent of salty fish and wet wood. It was the setting for one of the quietest weddings I've ever witnessed. No music, no party, just two people standing together in the dark of the old wooden pews and the light streaming through the stained glass windows, streaked by time. The groom was a barrel maker, his hands calloused, his coat neatly brushed, yet still carrying the scent of pine resin and oak. The bride was a laundress, her hair still damp with soap and her apron bearing the wet stains that hadn't quite dried. They stood there, looking at each other, as if the whole world had stepped back, leaving only one true moment, a promise made in silence. There was no priest, no grand ceremony, only an old friend, Mr. Abel, the church keeper, who read the vows. You are not rich, he said, but you have each other, and if you are lucky, you will grow old together in the same house with the same hearth burning through the winter. Outside, the sound of wheels rolling on stone, boats docking, and crows calling to each other. But inside that little church, time seemed to stop. They exchanged a smile, not dazzling, but as enduring as stone in the midst of a storm. I left when the church bells rang softly. No flowers were thrown, no songs were sung, but love at that moment was real, and it existed silently, just like the city growing outside day by day. The barber of Pearl Street. Pearl Street in the early morning had a strange appearance, both tranquil and bustling. Horace didn't speak much. He had a habit of washing his hands with warm water for a long time before starting his work, as if washing away the worries that had lingered from the day before. The old razor with a worn ivory handle was still sharp, just as it had been the first time he held it, the day he took over the craft. Sitting in his chair, people didn't just come for a shave, but to shed something, unspoken worries, unfinished dreams, or simmering anger that hadn't yet found words. He listened in silence, like a monk keeping a vow, and each stroke of the razor on the skin was a gentle cut into the chaos of daily life. Some people told him of lost love, others asked, "Do I still have the strength to face another winter?" Some just sat, closed their eyes, and breathed to feel that, at least for now, they were still alive. Horace never replied. He shaved, wiped away the blood if there was any, and smiled softly, as if with a silent yes. In the end, he would always say one thing: "It will be all right, my friend, it will be all right." His shop was small, but to me, it was the only place in New York at that time that made me believe that people could still listen to one another, not through flowery words, but through honest presence. Wings of wind on the northern hill. That afternoon the sky was still, with no wind. They came from all over: a red-haired German, a sun-darkened Dutchman from the sea salt, an Irishman speaking crisp English, and even the black men bought as tools but still bowing their heads, carrying wood, laying stones, and fixing shafts with dedication, never complaining. On the high hill no one was anyone. There was only labor, sweat, and invisible patience. I remember an old Frenchman named Baptiste, who was over 60 but still climbed the scaffold's peak with legs as sinewy as a stretched bowstring. He didn't talk much, only occasionally humming a line of an old hymn in a nasal voice, so faint that it could have been the wind if it weren't for the fact that it was a windless day. They built the windmill not just to grind flour, they built it as if erecting a symbol of hope. A place that could feed a family, where the windmill blades would turn in the sun and wind like the wings of possibility. That evening, when the first shaft began to turn, not thanks to the wind, but by the strength of 4 men pushing with all their might, everyone clapped, cheered, and then laughed. Baptiste stood there, tilted his head upward, his eyes red-rimmed. "We've built something that will never stop turning," he said, "even when we're no longer here." I left the hill with a strange feeling, as if a part of New York had truly been born from the dust, from the humble but great hands of the poor. The Hanover Square Bookshop. Hanover Square that autumn was flooded with the vibrant yellow of maple leaves and the dust of books, hidden behind. I remember a mixed-race boy about 12 years old named Thomas. He often hid in the back corner of the shop, absorbed in books about the world, Paris, Cairo, West Africa. When teased by the people outside, calling him the nigger with the books, he would bow his head in silence. But when inside the shop, his eyes lit up as though he were truly alive. One day, Mr. Whitlow handed Thomas a brown leather-bound book. "Take it home," he said. "Books are your home." I once asked him, "Why don't you keep it for the customers?" He only smiled and said, "Some books aren't for sale, but for living on through children who dream." That night the sky rumbled like a war drum. The rain poured relentlessly onto the rotting wooden roof, the streets flooded, and the wind howled with gusts like the cries of lost souls. The tavern was called the Black Gull, with dim yellow lights, walls soaked in the scent of smoke, animal skins, and the sharp stench of rum. The owner was a Scottish man named Fergus, with wild red hair and a voice that sounded like iron scraping against stone. In the corner of the tavern that night there were 5 men, a captain, drenched in water, eyes bloodshot, tired but still raising their cups. I sat close to the fireplace, shivering in my old cloak. A man covered in tattoos told a story. On the sea there's nothing truly dead. All souls drift, get lost, and return, never challenge the wind. Everyone fell silent. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the rain beating against the wooden door. Fergus nodded. "On the sea there's nothing truly dead. All souls drift, get lost, and return, never challenge the wind." I couldn't help but wonder. The Soldier on Broadway Street. That morning, the sun rose as if reluctantly, just barely peeking over the horizon. I was using a wooden shovel to clear the path in front of a small pharmacy on Broadway Street when he appeared, a man with a straight posture, graying hair, wearing the old uniform of the local militia. His presence reminded me of the days when England sent soldiers to control the colonies. In his hands, instead of a weapon, was a large broom for sweeping snow. We cleared the snow together for a while, in silence. It wasn't until I asked him which military he had served in that he nodded. The Royal Army. I fell silent. He continued, his eyes fixed on the street. In 1762, I was stationed at Fort Oswego. There was a native girl, her name was Winona. Her eyes were like an autumn lake, her voice soft like the wind through the maple leaves. We swore vows beneath the moon. Then the orders came. We retreated, destroyed the fort, burned the maps. I didn't have time to say goodbye. His hand trembled. A piece of ice slid off the eaves and shattered on the ground. I returned to New York, but she never appeared again. They say her village was wiped out. She might have died, or she might have just vanished like morning mist. The morning went on and the snow began to melt. The old soldier walked on, his steps slow, as if moving through another snow-covered memory far away. The cry in the cold frame. I remember vividly that late afternoon, November 1700, when the light from the setting sun seemed to flicker faintly across the town. The old woman named Mathilda lived in a small room behind the decaying church. No one visited that church anymore, only she and her 12 stray cats. Every evening she would place old wooden bowls on the steps, fill them with thin milk, and call out the strange names that she said were the names of the children who had passed. I visited her after hearing from the town's postman that she was the last one who remembered the strange disappearance of 3 children from the Elias family, the carpenter, in 1701. One snowy evening the 3 children went to gather firewood, and then vanished, she whispered, her hand trembling as she petted a black cat. No trace, no cries, just the church bell ringing at midnight, but who pulled the bell? No one was there. I looked up at the top of the bell tower, the cross tilted precariously. Mathilda stood up, pointing out through the broken window. They didn't disappear, they are still here in the stones, in the cold air, in the darkness of New York, the souls that haven't crossed over. I left the church as the night fell. On my way home, I swore I heard the cry of children. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel.